There is a version of the Middle Ages you were taught in school. Knights in shining armor, castles perched on hillsides, kings ruling by divine right. It is a clean story, easy to understand, wrapped in the romance of a distant past. But what if that story was never meant to be true? What if the history books you trusted were carefully written by people who had everything to gain from you believing one version of events while the real story stayed buried in shadows? Medieval Europe wasn't the simple world of good kings and bad kings, of holy crusades and chivalric codes. It was something far more complex, far more dangerous. Behind every crown sat invisible figures who never appeared in paintings or official records. These were the people who actually decided which kingdoms would rise and which would fall. They whispered advice that became royal policy. They moved gold that became armies. They carried secrets that could topple dynasties. And they made certain that when scribes wrote the official histories, their names would never appear on those pages. The records we have from the medieval period weren't written by neutral observers. They were crafted by monks working for the church, by court chroniclers serving kings, by victors who conquered their enemies and then conquered the narrative. Every medieval manuscript that survived to reach us passed through hands that had reasons to shape what you would eventually read. Facts were polished smooth or chiseled away entirely. Inconvenient deaths became divine will. Political murders became tragic accidents. Conspiracies that shaped the fate of nations vanished into carefully worded phrases that revealed nothing while appearing to say everything. Consider what we don't find in official medieval records. The meetings that happened after dark in monastery cells, the letters that were burned immediately after being read, the oaths sworn in languages designed to be incomprehensible to outsiders, the networks of people across different kingdoms who somehow coordinated actions without leaving traces. These absences aren't accidents. They're evidence of something that was deliberately kept hidden, a parallel structure of power that operated beneath everything visible. Recent discoveries have started to crack open this hidden history. Archaeological excavations beneath medieval buildings reveal chambers that aren't mentioned in any known documents. New analysis of old manuscripts using modern technology exposes text that was scraped away and overwritten. Financial records that survived by chance show money flowing in patterns that make no sense according to the official story of who controlled what. Letters preserved in forgotten archives reference events, and people that shouldn't exist according to everything we thought we knew. What emerges from these fragments is unsettling. Medieval rulers who appeared all-powerful were often trapped in webs they couldn't escape, manipulated by forces they barely understood. Wars that seemed to erupt over religion or territory were actually fought for reasons that had nothing to do with what soldiers were told. Treaties that made no strategic sense suddenly become clear when you realize they served hidden agendas that had been planned for years. Even the great movements of medieval history, the Crusades and Inquisitions and Reformations, start to look different when you ask who actually benefited from these upheavals and who quietly accumulated power while everyone else was distracted by spectacle. The medieval world was an arena where information itself was a weapon more valuable than any sword. Those who controlled what people knew controlled everything else. And the greatest conspiracy of all was convincing future generations that no conspiracies had ever existed, that history simply unfolded according to the visible actions of visible men, that nothing important ever happened in the shadows. But the shadows are where the real story has always lived, waiting for someone to finally look closely enough to see what has been there all along. When you picture medieval power, you probably see a pyramid. The king at the top, nobles beneath him, knights below them, and peasants at the bottom. It is the feudal system from every textbook, neat and orderly. But that pyramid was a facade, a structure designed to be visible precisely because it wasn't where real power lived. The actual architecture of medieval control looked nothing like what was displayed in throne rooms and official ceremonies. It was a web, not a pyramid, and the strands of that web connected people and institutions whose relationships were never meant to be understood by those outside the network. Medieval kings sat on thrones, but they rarely sat securely. Behind each crowned head moved figures who never wore crowns themselves, but wielded influence that could make or unmake dynasties. There was always a banker, someone who controlled the flow of gold that paid for armies and loyalty. There was always a priest, someone who could declare a ruler's actions blessed by God or condemned as sin. And there was always someone in the shadows, someone whose name appeared in no official record, but whose presence everyone at court understood and feared. These weren't exceptions to how power worked. They were the rule, repeated in every kingdom across Europe. The church wasn't simply a religious institution. It was an intelligence network that spanned the entire continent, with priests in every village and bishops in every major city reporting information up through hierarchies that ultimately reached Rome. The papacy knew what was happening in distant kingdoms, often before those kingdoms' own rulers understood the situation. This information became leverage, traded and deployed to advance papal interests that had little to do with salvation and everything to do with temporal power. Excommunication wasn't just a spiritual threat. It was a political weapon that could release subjects from their oaths of loyalty, turning a king's own people against him with a single papal decree. Then there were the Templars, knights who claimed to protect pilgrims, but actually created the medieval world's most sophisticated banking system. They moved money across borders, held deposits for nobles and kings, and knew the financial secrets of everyone who used their services. That knowledge made them powerful in ways that had nothing to do with the swords they carried. A Templar commander might know that a king was bankrupt, that a noble was funding his rival's army, that a merchant guild was preparing to manipulate grain prices. Information like that could be used to guide decisions, to pressure cooperation, to ensure that those who held the information remained essential to those who held the titles. Merchant guilds controlled more than trade routes. They controlled the flow of everything that moved between kingdoms. Goods, certainly, but also letters, rumors, and intelligence. A merchant traveling from Venice to London had legitimate reasons to ask questions, to observe fortifications, to notice which nobles were buying weapons and which were selling land. Guilds shared this information among their members, creating a network that knew the economic and political situation across Europe in ways that no single kingdom's spies could match. When guilds decided to support one ruler over another, they could strangle an economy or flood it with resources, making their favor more valuable than any military alliance. There were also the scholars, the alchemists and astrologers and philosophers who collected books that the church had declared forbidden. They preserved knowledge from Greece and Rome, from Islamic and Jewish sources, from traditions that predated Christianity itself. This knowledge wasn't just academic curiosity. It included medical techniques, engineering principles, mathematical systems, and philosophical ideas that challenged the entire structure of medieval society. Those who possessed such knowledge became advisors to rulers who wanted advantages their enemies didn't have. They worked in private chambers, translating texts that couldn't be publicly acknowledged, teaching princes secrets that couldn't be spoken in throne rooms. These groups didn't work together in harmony. They competed, formed temporary alliances, betrayed each other when opportunity arose. A Templar might sell information to a merchant guild to undermine a bishop's political maneuvering. A scholar might play two rival kings against each other to secure funding and protection. The church might declare a crusade not to reclaim holy sites, but to redirect the military power of troublesome nobles away from papal territories. The medieval political landscape was a constant collision of conspiracies, each group pursuing its own interests, while the official story presented everything as the natural unfolding of divine will and noble honor. Medieval rulers understood this reality better than anyone. They lived surrounded by people whose true loyalties were uncertain, whose advice might serve hidden masters, whose presence at court might be the prelude to assassination. Paranoia wasn't a character flaw for a medieval king. It was clear-eyed recognition of how power actually worked. The ones who survived were those who learned to navigate the web, to balance competing powers against each other, to never trust completely and never act without considering whose interests they were truly serving. Those who believed the official story of their own authority rarely lived long enough to learn better. When you can't speak openly, you learn to speak in ways that sound like something else entirely. Medieval conspirators became masters of this art, developing languages within languages, messages hidden inside messages that could travel across Europe in full view of everyone, yet remain invisible to those not meant to see them. A letter about grain shipments might actually detail troop movements. A love song performed in a noble's hall might carry instructions for a political assassination. A new cathedral's decorative stonework might encode philosophical ideas that would get the architect burned as a heretic if anyone understood what they were looking at. The Templars perfected this necessity into a system. Their financial operations required secure communication across distances where a letter might pass through a dozen hostile territories before reaching its destination. They developed ciphers that transformed transaction details into seemingly mundane correspondence. A modern cryptographer examining these medieval codes found principles that wouldn't be formally discovered by mathematicians for another 500 years. The Templars were using substitution methods, transposition techniques, and even early forms of key-based encryption, all disguised within records that appeared to be nothing more than routine business documentation. Alchemical texts offered another layer of concealment. To most readers, these manuscripts seem to discuss the transformation of base metals into gold, the search for immortality, the mystical properties of mercury and sulfur. But initiates understood that the true subject wasn't chemistry at all. The processes described were metaphors for political transformation, spiritual enlightenment, or practical knowledge that couldn't be written plainly. When an alchemist wrote about purifying gold through fire, he might actually be describing how to destabilize a kingdom's currency. The symbolic language provided perfect cover, dismissed by authorities as harmless mysticism, while conveying genuinely dangerous information to those who possessed the key to translation. Religious pilgrimages served purposes that had nothing to do with salvation. A merchant traveling to Santiago de Compostela or Jerusalem had legitimate reasons to cross borders, to ask questions, to meet people in distant cities. No one questioned a pilgrim's presence or wondered why they spoke with local nobles and priests. Meanwhile, information flowed along these pilgrimage routes like water through channels. A conspiracy forming in southern France could coordinate with sympathizers in northern Italy through pilgrims who carried messages in their memories, never writing anything down, reciting coded phrases to the right people in the right cities before moving on. The infrastructure of religious devotion became the infrastructure of political coordination. Even illiteracy worked to the conspirators' advantage. In a world where most people couldn't read, a written letter was already a form of code, incomprehensible to the vast majority who might see it. A messenger carrying encrypted correspondence could travel openly because even if the letter was discovered, the finder likely couldn't read at all. And if they could, they'd find only meaningless arrangements of words that appeared to be corrupted Latin or merchant's shorthand. Only someone with education and the specific cipher could extract meaning, creating layers of security through the very structure of medieval society. Some knowledge never touched paper at all. Memory palaces, techniques inherited from classical rhetoric, allowed trained individuals to store vast amounts of information in mental structures, retrieving it perfectly when needed without leaving any physical evidence. Oral traditions preserved through initiatic societies passed dangerous ideas from master to student, across generations, each repetition a careful act of remembrance that left nothing for inquisitors to find and burn. The absence of evidence wasn't proof of absence, it was proof of sophistication. Medieval conspirators didn't work with primitive tools. They inherited techniques from Roman spies, Byzantine diplomats, and Islamic scholars, then refined these methods for their own purposes. They understood that the best hiding place was often plain sight, that the most secure message was one that looked like something harmless, that the strongest network was one built into the ordinary infrastructure of medieval life. Cathedrals rose with secrets in their stones, songs spread carrying more than melodies, and across Europe, those who knew how to look could read messages that were always there, waiting to be understood. November 1095. The Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II stands before a crowd and delivers a speech that will send thousands to their deaths in the deserts of the East. History remembers his words as a spontaneous outpouring of religious passion, a divine call to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control. But spontaneity is rarely what it appears to be when popes are involved. What happened at Clermont wasn't inspiration. It was the final move in a conspiracy that had been carefully constructed over years, piece by piece, to solve problems that had nothing to do with Jerusalem and everything to do with Urban's desperate need to survive. Urban wasn't speaking from a position of strength. He was barely holding onto power. The Holy Roman Emperor had his own preferred candidate for the papacy, an antipope named Clement III who controlled Rome itself, while Urban operated from exile. Half of Europe's bishops recognized Clement, not Urban, as the legitimate pope. The church was fracturing, papal authority was collapsing, and Urban needed something dramatic, something that would force the entire Christian world to acknowledge his supremacy and forget that his claim to the papal throne was contested. He needed to redirect attention, to create a crisis that only he could lead, to transform himself from a disputed claimant into an unquestionable authority. The Crusade accomplished this perfectly. By calling for a holy war, Urban positioned himself as the voice of God's will, the spiritual commander of all Christendom. Kings and emperors might dispute his authority in theological matters, but who could argue against liberating Jerusalem? The genius was in the framing. Urban wasn't asking for support in his political struggles. He was offering something far more attractive: salvation, adventure, and the promise of wealth in the East. Knights who had spent years fighting each other over scraps of European territory suddenly had a grand purpose, a mission blessed by heaven, and a convenient solution to younger sons who would never inherit land at home. Correspondence that survived in obscure archives reveals the preparation behind Clermont. Urban had been coordinating with specific French nobles for months, men who understood exactly what they stood to gain from a successful Eastern campaign. These weren't random supporters swept up in religious fervor. They were political allies who had been promised that new kingdoms carved from conquered Muslim territory would be theirs to rule. The Crusade wasn't just about Jerusalem. It was about creating new power structures in the East that would be loyal to the papacy, extending Urban's influence into territories where neither the Holy Roman Emperor nor the Byzantine Emperor could challenge him. The speech itself was crafted using techniques that went back to Roman rhetoric. Urban had been educated in the classical tradition, and he understood crowd psychology in ways that modern propagandists would recognize. The delegates at Clermont hadn't been randomly assembled. They'd been selected over weeks, primed with preliminary messages about the suffering of Eastern Christians, fed stories designed to generate outrage and religious fervor. By the time Urban stood to speak, the audience was already prepared to respond exactly as he needed them to. When the crowd began chanting "God wills it," it felt spontaneous. But spontaneity in such gatherings is usually the result of careful preparation. Financial records show another dimension of the conspiracy. The Crusade generated revenue streams that transformed papal finances. Indulgences sold to those who couldn't. Fight personally brought gold flowing into church coffers. Taxes levied on crusaders and their supporters created income that funded not just the expedition, but papal operations across Europe. Property donated or sold by crusaders before their departure enriched monasteries and bishops loyal to Urban. The entire enterprise was structured to strengthen the institutional church while presenting itself as pure religious devotion. There was also the matter of the Byzantine Emperor Alexios, who had requested Western military assistance against Turkish advances. Urban saw opportunity in this request. If the crusade succeeded, he could claim credit for saving Eastern Christianity and potentially bring the Orthodox Church back under papal authority. The schism between Rome and Constantinople had been formalized only 40 years earlier. Urban imagined himself as the Pope who reunited Christendom under Roman leadership, using military success to accomplish what theological negotiations had failed to achieve. The propaganda was masterful. Urban spoke of atrocities against Christian pilgrims, described holy sites desecrated by infidels, painted a picture of a righteous war where God himself commanded action. Much of this was exaggeration or invention, but it didn't matter. The narrative served its purpose. Within months, armies were forming across Europe, not because common soldiers understood the complex political situation, but because they believed they were answering a divine call. Meanwhile, Urban had successfully repositioned himself from a contested pope scrambling for legitimacy into the unquestioned spiritual leader of a movement that unified Christian Europe under his authority. When those armies finally marched east, Urban had already won the game that actually mattered to him. The Crusade's success or failure in military terms was secondary to what it had accomplished politically. The anti-pope's support evaporated as even his backers recognized they could oppose a movement blessed with such apparent divine favor. Urban's legitimacy was established. Papal authority was reasserted. and the precedent was set for future popes to call crusades whenever they needed to redirect European violence toward useful ends or generate revenue through the machinery of holy war. Jerusalem fell in 1099, and chronicles recorded it as a triumph of faith over infidelity. But the real victory had already happened years earlier, in the quiet planning sessions where a desperate pope realized that the best way to save his position was to send thousands to die for a cause that served his ambitions while appearing to serve God. The conspiracy wasn't hidden in shadows. It was performed in public, disguised as the most sincere religious devotion, and millions believed exactly what they were meant to believe. In 1119, nearly 20 years after the First Crusade captured Jerusalem, 9 French knights approached King Baldwin II with an unusual request. They wanted to establish a new military order, they said, dedicated to protecting Christian pilgrims traveling the dangerous roads to the Holy City. The king granted them quarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, built on the southern end of the Temple Mount, the very place where Solomon's temple had stood before the Romans destroyed it 1,000 years earlier. These knights called themselves the Poor Fellow, soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. History would remember them as the Knights Templar. But here is what doesn't make sense about the official story. For nearly a decade, these 9 knights did almost nothing to protect pilgrims. They didn't patrol roads. They didn't establish outposts along dangerous routes. They barely recruited new members. Instead, they focused all their energy on their headquarters at the Temple Mount, and they started digging. Archaeological excavations conducted in the 20th century revealed the extent of what the Templars did during those first mysterious years. Beneath the Temple Mount, researchers found tunnels that hadn't been documented in any known historical records. These weren't crude excavations. They showed sophisticated engineering, the kind that requires knowledge of structural integrity and underground architecture. The tunnels went deep, passing through layers of construction from different periods: Ottoman, Crusader, Byzantine, Roman, Herodian, and older still. Someone had mapped these layers before the digging began. Someone knew exactly where they were going and what they were looking for. The question that historians have struggled with is simple. How did 9 French knights know where to dig beneath a structure built by Romans on top of ruins from ancient Jewish temples? These weren't archaeologists or scholars. They were warriors from families in Champagne and Burgundy, men whose education should have been limited to swordplay and estate management. Yet they possessed knowledge about Jerusalem's underground geography that shouldn't have existed in medieval Europe. The Romans had destroyed the Second Temple in 70 AD. Jewish records of what lay beneath had been scattered or lost. Christian pilgrims knew the site's religious significance, but not its physical structure hidden under centuries of rubble and reconstruction. Unless someone had preserved that knowledge, unless there were maps, documents, descriptions that had survived through channels that never appeared in official histories, Roman records, Jewish texts smuggled out before the temple's destruction, early Christian writings from when Jerusalem was still accessible. The Templars' founders spent years preparing for their journey east. Evidence suggests they consulted with scholars, sought out rare manuscripts, made connections with people who possessed information that wasn't commonly available. They weren't improvising when they started digging. They were following a plan that had been developed before they ever left France. What were they searching for? The speculation has never stopped. Some theories point to the Ark of the Covenant, the golden chest that had held the original 10 Commandments, an object that disappeared from biblical narratives during the Babylonian conquest and had never been reliably located since. Others suggest ancient scrolls, texts from the Second Temple period that might have contained teachings suppressed by later Christian orthodoxy or knowledge from Jewish mystical traditions. Still others believe the Templars sought treasure in the conventional sense, gold and silver hidden by priests before the Roman destruction, wealth that would explain how 9 poor knights suddenly became rich enough to establish preceptories across Europe. Early Templar documents hint at discoveries without specifying what was discovered. Letters between Templar leadership use phrases like the treasure of the temple and secrets that must be protected. Language that suggests they found something significant but could or would describe it plainly. The Order's rule, the document governing Templar behavior, contains passages about guarding mysteries and maintaining silence about matters known only to initiated members. This wasn't T-standard language for a military order supposedly focused on protecting pilgrims. It was the language of a secret society built around knowledge that could be shared with outsiders. By 1129, just a decade after their founding, the Templars had transformed from 9 unknown knights into an organization recognized by the Pope, granted extraordinary privileges and attracting recruits from noble families across Europe. They were given exemption from paying tithes, allowed to keep spoils from Muslim territories, and granted permission to build their own churches. More importantly, they had acquired wealth that could be explained by donations alone. They purchased properties, established banking operations, and began acting less like a military order and more like an international power operating according to its own agenda. The archaeological evidence beneath the Temple Mount can be disputed. The tunnels are real, the excavation techniques demonstrate knowledge and purpose. What the Templars removed from those tunnels, however, vanished with them. No inventory exists. No contemporary chronicle describes what, if anything, emerged from years of digging in the darkness beneath one of history's most significant religious sites. The Templars kept their secrets, and when the order was finally suppressed 2 centuries later, those secrets either died with the last knights or were hidden so effectively that they've never been found. What we do know is that something changed during those years in Jerusalem. 9 knights entered the Holy Land as minor nobles with moderate resources. They left as the core of an organization that would become wealthier than kingdoms, more politically connected than most ruling families, and wrapped in mysteries that made them simultaneously revered and feared across Christian Europe. Whether they found ancient treasure, forbidden knowledge, or something else entirely, the search beneath the Temple Mount transformed them, and that transformation would reshape medieval power in ways that are still being uncovered today, one excavated tunnel and decoded document at a time. By 1150, barely 30 years after their founding, the Templars had become something unprecedented in medieval Europe. They owned fortresses across the Holy Land, maintained preceptories in every major European kingdom, and operated a financial network that made them indispensable to nobles and monarchs who needed to move money across vast distances. The official explanation for this rapid ascent points to generous donations from pious nobles and special papal privileges that exempted them from local laws and taxes. But the numbers don't support that narrative. Financial records that survived in scattered archives show wealth flowing into Templar coffers at rates that donations alone could explain, especially given that other religious orders with similar privileges never achieved anything close to Templar resources. The banking system they developed has been called the first international financial network, and that description understates how revolutionary it actually was. A pilgrim could deposit silver in Paris and withdraw it in Jerusalem weeks later using nothing but an encrypted letter. No physical transport of coins across bandit-infested roads and pirate-controlled seas. The Templar preceptory in Paris would send coded confirmation to Jerusalem, and the traveller would receive funds upon presenting proper documentation. This required not just trust between distant Templar houses, but sophisticated encryption to prevent forgery, standardized accounting practices across multiple kingdoms, and coordination mechanisms that could function despite the communication delays inherent in medieval travel. But financial services were only the visible layer of what the Templars had constructed. Their network of fortresses, churches, and preceptories created something else. An intelligence system that had no equal in medieval Europe. Templars traveled constantly between their holdings, carrying messages that passed through their internal communication channels, rather than relying on public couriers who could be intercepted or bribed. They maintained relationships with Muslim leaders during periods of official warfare, conducting negotiations that secular rulers could pursue without being accused of collaboration with infidels. They employed Jewish merchants and translators who could move between Christian and Muslim territories with relative freedom. These connections gave the Templars access to information that kings and popes desperately wanted, and information in medieval politics was often more valuable than armies. Evidence of Templar political intervention appears in unexpected places throughout the 12th and 13th centuries. When the Kingdom of Jerusalem faced bankruptcy in 1168, a Templar loan saved the crown, but came with conditions that gave the order effective control over royal policy. When succession disputes erupted in Aragon, Templar support for one claimant proved decisive, and that kingdom remained unusually favourable to Templar interests for decades afterward. Papal elections during this period show patterns suggesting Templar influence. Candidates who had previously supported the order became popes with suspicious frequency, while those who had opposed Templar privileges often found their campaigns suddenly undermined by financial difficulties or well-timed scandals. The order's connections with groups outside Christian orthodoxy raised eyebrows even in their own time. Templars maintained cordial relationships with Muslim scholars in territories they controlled, relationships that went beyond pragmatic truces into genuine intellectual exchange. They employed Jewish financial advisors and translators, giving these individuals access to Christian courts that would normally be closed to them. Perhaps most suspicious, Templars showed unusual tolerance toward Christian heretics, occasionally protecting Cathars and other dissidents from church persecution in regions where Templar authority superseded local bishops. These weren't the actions expected from an order supposedly dedicated to defending Orthodox Christianity. The secrets they guarded, whatever had been discovered beneath the Temple Mount, remained protected by oaths that bound Templar members to silence under penalty of expulsion or worse. Initiation ceremonies were conducted in private, hidden from external observers. The order's inner hierarchy maintained knowledge that ordinary members never accessed. Documents from this period reference the treasure and the secret of the temple in language that suggests these weren't metaphorical concepts, but actual physical things that the order's leadership controlled and protected. This accumulation of wealth, influence, and mystery generated resentment that grew more dangerous with each passing decade. Kings who borrowed from Templars resented owing money to warrior monks who claimed poverty while living in fortresses that rivaled royal castles. Bishops resented an organization that answered only to the Pope and could ignore local church authority. Nobles resented Templar wealth that eclipsed their own holdings. The order had become too powerful, too independent, too mysterious. They operated across kingdoms with an autonomy that threatened the very concept of territorial sovereignty. They knew too much about too many important people. They held debts that could bankrupt rulers, and they showed no signs of recognizing any authority beyond their own Grand Master and the papacy. By the late 13th century, the Templars existed in a precarious position. Their military function had become questionable after the final loss of Christian territories in the Holy Land. Their banking operations had made them rich, but also made them targets. Their secrets had protected them, but also made them threatening. And kingdoms across Europe, particularly France, were looking at the order's wealth with the kind of hunger that makes powerful men willing to destroy whatever stands between them and what they want. The Templars had built an empire on secrets extracted from beneath Jerusalem. But empires built on secrets carry a fundamental vulnerability. When everyone wonders what you're hiding, someone will eventually decide that taking it by force is worth the risk. And in medieval Europe, when a king decided he wanted what you had, divine protection and papal favor might not be enough to save you. In the hills and valleys of southern France during the 12th and 13th centuries, a religious movement flourished that the Catholic Church would eventually decide could not be allowed to exist. They called themselves the Good Christians. History remembers them as Cathars, from the Greek word for pure. Their beliefs diverged from Catholic orthodoxy in ways that seemed, on the surface, to be standard theological disagreement. They believed the material world was created by an evil deity, that the soul was trapped in flesh, that salvation came through spiritual knowledge rather than sacraments administered by priests. The Church had dealt with similar heresies before, usually through debate, persuasion, and selective punishment of leaders who refused to recant. But the response to the Cathars was different. It was total, systematic, and horrifyingly violent. Pope Innocent III launched what would become known as the Albigensian Crusade in 1209, turning the military machinery of Christendom against fellow Christians in their own homeland. The campaign lasted decades and resulted in massacres that shocked even medieval sensibilities. When Crusaders captured the town of Béziers in 1209, they killed nearly everyone inside, perhaps 20,000 people. When asked how to distinguish Cathars from Catholics during the slaughter, the papal legate allegedly replied, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Entire cities were razed, populations were exterminated. And crucially, every Cathar text, every manuscript, every written record was systematically hunted down and burned. This level of violence suggests something beyond theological disagreement. The Church had tolerated various heresies for centuries, addressing them through argument and occasional execution of stubborn leaders. But the Cathar response was genocide paired with what can only be described as information warfare. The goal wasn't just to kill heretics, but to erase all evidence of what they had believed and taught. That kind of systematic destruction indicates terror of ideas themselves, fear that if Cathar teachings survived in written form, they could resurface and spread again even after the people who held them were dead. What were the Cathars actually teaching that made them so dangerous? The surviving fragments suggest their theology was more sophisticated than simple dualism between good and evil. They possessed texts that weren't part of the approved biblical canon, documents that predated the Council of Nicaea standardization of Christian scripture. Some of these were Gnostic Gospels that presented Jesus' teachings in ways that contradicted church doctrine, emphasizing direct spiritual knowledge over institutional authority. But there is evidence suggesting the Cathars preserved more than just alternative religious texts. Inquisitorial records, documents created while interrogating captured Cathars, contain tantalizing hints about what the heretics knew. References appear to astronomical knowledge, to understanding of celestial movements that shouldn't have been accessible in medieval southern France. Descriptions emerge of healing practices using herbs and techniques that suggest medical knowledge preserved from classical sources. Most intriguingly, interrogators documented Cathar teachings about sacred geometry and the mathematical relationships underlying creation, knowledge that sounds less like theology and more like the mystery school traditions of ancient Greece and Egypt. The Cathars also possessed dangerous knowledge of a different kind, detailed understanding of church corruption and historical manipulation. Living in regions where church authority was weaker than in Northern Europe, they had access to documents and oral traditions that revealed uncomfortable truths about how Christianity had developed. They knew about the political debates at early church councils where doctrine was determined by voting and imperial pressure rather than divine revelation. They understood which texts had been deliberately excluded from the biblical canon and why. They could articulate how the church had compromised with temporal power, how bishops had become princes, how the institution claiming to represent Christ had betrayed his teachings about poverty and humility. This was perhaps the most threatening knowledge of all. The church's authority rested on claims of divine foundation and unbroken apostolic succession from Peter. If the Cathars could demonstrate that church doctrine was the result of human political decisions, that significant Christian texts had been suppressed, that the entire institutional structure was a later invention that would have been unrecognizable to early Christians, then the theological justification for papal power collapsed. Every tithe collected, every indulgence sold, every political intervention justified by spiritual authority would be revealed as fraud. The Cathars also rejected the material hierarchy that structured medieval society. They taught that spiritual advancement had nothing to do with wealth or social position, that the rituals conducted by corrupt priests had no power, that ordinary people could access divine truth directly without ecclesiastical mediation. In a society built on rigid hierarchies justified by religious ideology, these ideas were revolutionary. If the Cathars were right, then the entire system of church-sanctioned feudalism lost its legitimacy. Peasants had no obligation to pay tithes to priests or rents to lords. Nobles had no divine right to their positions. The whole structure could collapse once enough people understood that it rested on claims the Cathars could prove were false. The brutality of the Albigensian Crusade makes sense in this context. The church wasn't just fighting heresy, it was fighting for survival against ideas that could destroy the entire medieval order. Every Cathar who lived was a potential teacher who could spread dangerous knowledge. Every Cathar text that survived was a bomb waiting to explode the legitimacy of church authority. The massacres and book burnings weren't religious persecution in the conventional sense. They were desperate attempts to eliminate information that the powerful could refute, and therefore had to eradicate. By 1255, organized Cathar communities had been destroyed. The last known Cathar perfect, Guillaume B. Bali-based, was burned in 1321. The church had achieved its goal of physical extermination, but genocides of ideas are harder to complete than genocides of people. Knowledge has a way of surviving, of flowing through channels that violence can completely seal. Inquisitors who interrogated Cathars heard their teachings and recorded fragments even while condemning them. Books that were ordered burned sometimes survived because someone hid a copy. Students who learned from Cathar teachers but escaped execution carried memories of what they'd been taught. The question that remained after the fires burned out and the blood dried was whether the knowledge the Cathars possessed had truly been destroyed, or whether it had simply gone underground, waiting in hidden manuscripts and secret traditions for a time when it could safely emerge again. The church had won the war against the Cathars, but wars against ideas are never truly won. They only driven into darkness, where they wait and evolve, and sometimes return in forms that those who thought they'd achieved victory never anticipated. Book burnings make excellent public spectacles. Flames consuming heretical texts in town squares sent clear messages about what happened to forbidden knowledge and those who possessed it. Inquisitors understood theatre. They knew that destroying dangerous ideas required not just confiscating manuscripts, but demonstrating their destruction, where everyone could witness the church's power over information. What they couldn't know, was that while fires blazed in public spaces in hidden chambers across Europe, scribes were copying the very texts being burned, building an underground library that would outlast the persecution. Medieval information control faced a fundamental problem. Knowledge exists in multiple forms simultaneously. A book burned in Paris might have copies in Toledo, Alexandria, or Baghdad. An idea suppressed in France could survive in Italy, then return decades later through routes inquisitors never imagined. The church controlled most scriptoriums and nearly all formal education, but control is never absolute. There were always gaps, always sympathetic monks who valued preservation over orthodoxy, always wealthy patrons willing to fund secret copying of texts they believed mattered more than their own safety. Some monasteries developed dual identities. Their official scriptoriums produced approved texts, copying scripture and church fathers under the watchful eyes of abbots loyal to papal authority. But in private chambers accessible only to trusted individuals, different work occurred. Banned philosophical treatises were copied with extreme care. Heretical gospels were transcribed and hidden in locations known only to an inner circle. Classical works that contradicted church teaching were preserved despite official prohibitions. These secret scriptoriums operated for decades, sometimes centuries, protected by abbots who believed that preserving knowledge justified the enormous risk of discovery. Knowledge also survived through transformation. Alchemical texts appeared to discuss transmuting lead into gold, but initiates understood the symbolic language concealed political philosophy and natural science that couldn't be openly expressed. What looked like incomprehensible mystical rambling to inquisitors was actually sophisticated chemistry and metaphysics wrapped in protective symbolism. Religious art encoded information in ways that remain difficult to decipher even today. Cathedral architecture incorporated geometric and mathematical principles that served as three-dimensional textbooks for those trained to read them. A rose window wasn't just decoration, it was a diagram of cosmological relationships. A particular arrangement of columns expressed numerical harmonies. The buildings themselves became books that couldn't be burned. Folk tales preserved wisdom that predated Christianity, carrying it forward through generations of oral tradition. Stories about magical transformations contained actual techniques for consciousness alteration. Fairy tales about hidden treasures mapped real locations where texts or artifacts had been concealed. Ballads sung by wandering minstrels carried coded messages between communities of initiated listeners. The knowledge moved through society's lower levels, where church control was weakest, transmitted by people who couldn't read Latin, but who memorized and repeated narratives with perfect accuracy across lifetimes. Jewish and Muslim communities played crucial roles in this preservation network. They maintained their own literary traditions outside church authority, creating spaces where texts banned in Christian Europe could survive. Islamic scholars in Spain and North Africa preserved Greek philosophy, mathematics, and medicine that had been lost to Western Europe. When Christian scholars wanted access to Aristotle's works banned by the church, they traveled to Toledo or Córdoba, learned Arabic, and translated texts that would eventually revolutionize European thought. Jewish communities maintained connections across vast distances, allowing manuscripts to move from Provence to Egypt to the Levant beyond the reach of any single authority. The most remarkable preservation network involved texts that disappeared just before persecution struck and reappeared centuries later in unexpected contexts. Templar documents vanished during the order's suppression in the early 14th century, then surfaced in Scottish archives 200 years later. Cathar Gospels that should have been completely destroyed turned up in Italian libraries with no clear explanation of how they'd arrived. Gnostic texts that the early church had supposedly eliminated were discovered in Egyptian caves in the 20th century, perfectly preserved, suggesting that someone had known exactly where to hide them for maximum survival probability. What we call the Renaissance, the supposed rediscovery of classical knowledge, was partially theatre. Much of that knowledge had never been truly lost. It had been carefully maintained by networks operating beneath the surface of medieval society, waiting for historical moments when persecution relaxed enough to allow dangerous ideas back into public discourse. When Renaissance scholars suddenly produced classical texts and ancient philosophies, they often accessed private libraries that had preserved these works through centuries of official suppression. The underground library wasn't a single location but a distributed network of hiding places, copied texts, and human memories that kept forbidden knowledge alive despite systematic efforts at destruction. Some of these repositories have been discovered. Medieval manuscripts turn up regularly in unexpected places, their presence often unexplainable through official histories. But the most tantalizing possibility is that some hiding places remain undiscovered. Sealed chambers in old monasteries, buried caches in regions that were centers of heretical activity. Private collections that pass through families for generations, their significance forgotten but their contents preserved. The knowledge that threatened medieval authority didn't die when people were burned or books were destroyed. It adapted, hid, transformed into forms that could survive persecution. It moved through networks that operated according to logic that inquisitors couldn't comprehend because they couldn't imagine that knowledge itself possessed survival instincts, that ideas could evolve strategies for persistence that made them nearly impossible to eliminate completely. The underground library preserved more than texts. It preserved the possibility that truth, once known, can never be completely unknown, no matter how much violence is deployed to make it disappear. The greatest hiding place is often complete visibility. While the church hunted heretics in forests and cellars, some of medieval Europe's most elaborate conspiracies operated openly in town squares and cathedral construction sites, disguised as ordinary professional organizations. The craft guilds, particularly those of stonemasons and metalworkers, presented themselves as simple trade associations protecting business interests and maintaining quality standards. But beneath that mundane surface existed something far more complex: organizational structures with initiations, hierarchies of secret knowledge, and symbolic systems that had nothing to do with cutting stone or forging iron. Stonemason guilds required elaborate initiation ceremonies for new members, rituals that involved oaths of secrecy, symbolic gestures, and passwords that allowed traveling craftsmen to prove their credentials at distant work sites. The official explanation was practical. These mechanisms prevented unskilled workers from claiming master status and protected trade secrets about construction techniques. But the rituals bore striking resemblance to mystery religions from ancient Greece and Rome, complete with references to sacred geometry, cosmological principles, and transformation symbolism that went far beyond vocational training. Master Masons possessed knowledge that medieval universities didn't teach. They understood mathematical relationships that wouldn't be formally described by European scholars for centuries. They employed geometric principles in cathedral design that encoded philosophical and cosmological ideas into the buildings themselves. A cathedral wasn't just a structure for worship, it was a three-dimensional manuscript written in stone, conveying information to those trained to read architectural language. The proportions of nave to transept expressed numerical harmonies derived from Pythagorean philosophy. The placement of windows and columns created geometric patterns that mapped celestial relationships. Sculptures positioned at specific locations told stories that contradicted official church teaching, visible to anyone but comprehensible only to initiates. These weren't accidents or aesthetic choices, they were deliberate encoding of knowledge that couldn't be openly expressed. a master mason who believed heretical ideas about the nature of reality or possessed understanding of mathematics, deemed suspicious by church authorities, could build those ideas into cathedrals, creating permanent records that would outlast any manuscript and couldn't be burned by inquisitors. The irony was exquisite. The very buildings constructed to glorify church power contained, encoded in their structure, ideas that challenged everything the church claimed about reality. Other secret networks operated with equal boldness. The courts of love, ostensibly gatherings where nobles discussed romantic poetry and courtly behavior, functioned as spaces where philosophical and political ideas could be explored through allegory and metaphor. A poem about love between a knight and an unattainable lady might actually discuss the soul's relationship to divine knowledge. Debates about proper courtly conduct could explore political philosophy that would be dangerous if expressed directly. The language of romance provided perfect cover for discussions that would attract inquisitorial attention if conducted in theological or political terms. Alchemists formed their own networks, corresponding across Europe in symbolic language that appeared to describe chemical processes, but actually conveyed natural philosophy, spiritual practices, and occasionally outright heresy. An alchemical text discussing the purification of base metals might actually describe techniques for achieving altered states of consciousness. Instructions for combining mercury and sulfur could encode political strategy or critique of church doctrine. The obscurity was intentional, creating multiple layers of meaning that protected authors while allowing initiated readers to extract genuine knowledge. Even older traditions survived by adapting their appearance to Christian contexts. Pagan seasonal celebrations became Christian feast days, but communities maintained older meanings beneath the new names. Healing practices that predated Christianity continued through folk medicine, disguised as prayers to saints but preserving techniques from pre-Christian sources. Sacred sites that had been holy to older religions became locations for Christian churches, but local populations remembered earlier significance and maintained practices that monks and bishops didn't recognize as survival of forbidden traditions. These various groups weren't isolated. Master masons belonged to courts of love. Alchemists consulted with craft guild members who could build specialized equipment. Physicians trained in folk healing traditions learned from alchemical texts. Jewish and Muslim scholars corresponded with Christian alchemists and philosophers. The networks overlapped, creating a hidden culture that spanned Europe, connecting individuals who thought differently from mainstream society, who valued knowledge that official institutions suppressed, who maintained continuity with intellectual traditions that weren't supposed to exist in Christian Europe. This underground network would eventually surface. The Renaissance emergence of classical learning wasn't spontaneous rediscovery. It was the result of knowledge carefully preserved by secret societies finally becoming safe enough to acknowledge openly. The Protestant Reformation's challenge to church authority drew on critiques that had been circulating in hidden networks for centuries. The scientific revolution's empirical approach had been practiced by alchemists and natural philosophers working in secret long before it became academically respectable. Medieval Europe wasn't the monolithic Christian civilization that official histories portrayed. Beneath the surface existed a parallel world of secret organizations, preserved knowledge, and alternative traditions. These societies operated in plain sight, hiding their real purposes behind mundane appearances, encoding their beliefs into art and architecture that everyone could see but only initiates could read. They built cathedrals that contained heresies, wrote poems that concealed philosophy, and maintained networks that connected free thinkers across kingdoms and centuries. The medieval world was always multiple worlds existing simultaneously, the official Christian order and the hidden tradition that preserved everything that order tried to destroy. And the hidden tradition was patient, knowing that what couldn't be spoken openly in one century might become acceptable truth in another, waiting through persecution for times when the secrets carved in stone and written in symbols could finally be read aloud without risk of flames. By 1307, Philip IV of France had a problem that threatened everything he de-built during 2 decades of rule. He was bankrupt. Wars against England and Flanders had drained the royal treasury. Lavish spending on courtly magnificence had consumed what remained. He already expelled Jewish moneylenders and seized their assets, a temporary solution that destroyed future lending options. He debased the currency so aggressively that his own subjects called him Philip the Counterfeiter behind closed doors. And still the debts mounted, crushing and unavoidable, held primarily by creditors who could be intimidated, manipulated, or ignored. The Knights Templar. The Templars weren't ordinary creditors. They were the royal treasurers handling Philip's finances with the same sophisticated banking operations they developed over 2 centuries. They knew exactly how much he owed to whom, and when payments were due. They held records documenting years of borrowing, detailing the gap between Philip's public image of royal magnificence and the reality of insolvency. Worse, they knew state secrets from their position at the heart of royal financial administration. They understood France's actual military capacity, its economic vulnerabilities, the loyalty price of various nobles. This knowledge made them dangerous in ways that went far beyond money. Philip could simply default. The Templars had military force, trained knights, fortified preceptories, international support from other Templar houses across Europe. They had political power, direct relationships with the Pope, connections to every major noble family, influence that rivaled his own. And they had something perhaps more threatening than armies or alliances: legitimacy. The Templars were a papal order, blessed by Rome, protected by ecclesiastical law. Moving against them meant confronting not just a powerful organization, but the authority of the church itself. So Philip chose a solution that was breathtaking in its audacity and horrifying in its implications. He would destroy the Templars completely, seize their assets to cover his debts, and eliminate the records proving what he owed. It wouldn't be robbery, it would be righteous persecution of heretics. Justice delivered to blasphemers who had betrayed Christ himself. He would turn his creditors into criminals, transform debt collection into divine judgment, and emerge not as a bankrupt king who stolen from the church, but as a faithful defender who exposed corruption in a supposedly holy order. The planning took years. Philip could act impulsively. The operation required coordination across the entire kingdom, simultaneous strikes on dozens of Templar properties, and careful preparation of the legal and theological justification that would make mass arrests acceptable to both nobility and church. He began positioning loyal supporters in key positions, men who would follow orders without questioning the unprecedented nature of what they'd be asked to do. He cultivated relationships with officials who administered royal justice, ensuring that when Templars were arrested, the legal machinery would process them according to his needs rather than ecclesiastical law that might protect them. Most crucially, Philip worked on Pope Clement V, who owed his election partly to Philip's support against rival candidates. Clement was French, physically based in Avignon rather than Rome, and dependent on French goodwill for protection and resources. Philip systematically increased pressure, making clear that the Templars represented a threat not just to France but to papal authority itself. He fed Clement reports of Templar heresy and misconduct, allegations that seemed to confirm suspicions that many had privately entertained about an organization that operated with such independence and mystery. The charges Philip manufactured were calculated to shock and horrify. Templars, he claimed, denied Christ during secret initiation ceremonies. They spat on the cross. They worshipped a mysterious severed head called Baphomet. They engaged in sexual practices that violated natural law and Christian morality. These accusations weren't chosen randomly. They echoed charges that had been used successfully against previous enemies, particularly the Cathars, whose destruction had provided a template for eliminating groups too powerful to confront through conventional means. Some allegations might have contained fragments of truth. The Templars had spent 2 centuries in the East, exposed to Islamic mysticism, Gnostic traditions, and esoteric practices that mainstream Christianity condemned. Their initiation rituals were secret. Their inner hierarchy practiced ceremonies that outsiders never witnessed. But whatever genuine heterodoxy existed was deliberately sensationalized, exaggerated, and misrepresented to justify destruction. Philip also prepared the practical aspects of what would be the largest coordinated law enforcement operation medieval Europe had ever seen. He needed to know the location of every Templar preceptory, the routines of their inhabitants, the defenses he'd need to overcome. Intelligence gathered over months documented Templar movements, catalogued their assets, identified which knights were where on any given day. Orders were prepared in advance, sealed and distributed to royal officials across France, with instructions not to open them until the 12th of October, 1307. The letters commanded simultaneous raids at dawn the following day, timed so that no Templar house would have warning that others were being attacked. Everything depended on surprise. If the Templars learned what was coming, they could evacuate their treasury, disperse their leadership, and mobilize military resistance that Philip's forces might not overcome. If they had time to appeal to the Pope before arrests occurred, ecclesiastical law might protect them from royal jurisdiction. If word spread through their international network, Templar houses outside France could prepare defenses or launch coordinated countermeasures. The operation had to be total, simultaneous, and so overwhelming that resistance would be impossible. Philip had made one more essential move. He de-insured that financial records proving exactly what he owed the Templars would be among the first things seized. Those documents needed to disappear before anyone could examine them too closely, before questions could be raised about whether the persecution was truly about heresy or actually about debt elimination. The wealth confiscated from the Templars would officially go to other religious orders, but enough would flow through royal hands to solve Philip's immediate crisis. And once the Templars were destroyed, their assets liquidated, and their leadership executed, no one would remain to claim what Philip had actually owed. By October 1307, everything was positioned. The Pope was prepared to support the operation, reluctantly perhaps, but support it nonetheless. Royal officials had their orders, the charges were formulated, the date was set. Philip had transformed desperation into strategy, insolvency into holy crusade against heresy. He was about to execute one of medieval history's most audacious conspiracies, destroying the most powerful financial and military organization in Europe to escape debts he never intended to repay. And he would do it all in the name of defending the faith, convinced that posterity would remember him as a righteous king who de-exposed corruption rather than a bankrupt monarch who de-committed theft on a scale unprecedented even in medieval politics. The Friday that would become infamous was approaching, and across France, Templars went about their daily routines, unaware that their king had already decided they were going to die. When Philip's forces raided Templar properties across France on the morning of the 13th of October 1307, they expected to find the treasure of the wealthiest organization in Christendom. What they found instead was far less than anticipated, and many of the Order's most important members were simply gone. The great Templar treasury in Paris, which should have contained gold, documents, and the financial records of 2 centuries, yielded a fraction of what intelligence had suggested should be there. High-ranking officers who normally resided at major preceptories were absent, their whereabouts unknown. It was as if someone had whispered a warning through the Templar network, and those who understood its significance had quietly vanished into the night. The most dramatic evidence of advance warning came from the port of La Rochelle. Weeks before the arrests, witnesses reported unusual activity at the Templar naval facility. Ships were loaded at night, cargo covered and guarded more heavily than normal operations required. Then, just days before the 13th of October, the Templar fleet departed. Contemporary accounts vary on how many ships left. Some say 18, others claim fewer. But they agree on the essential fact: the vessels sailed from French waters and were never conclusively seen again. Speculation about their destination has continued for 7 centuries. Scotland, where King Robert the Bruce was excommunicated, and beyond papal jurisdiction, Portugal, where the Templar order would survive under a different name. Some unknown location in the New World if the Templars possessed navigational knowledge that would become official European knowledge for another 2 centuries. The cargo those ships carried remains one of history's great mysteries. Was it gold and silver, the physical treasury that Philip wanted to seize? Or was it something more valuable, documents, scrolls, artifacts, whatever the Templars had discovered beneath the Temple Mount 2 centuries earlier? The fact that Philip's forces found so little at Templar properties suggests that something substantial had been removed. The question is whether it was merely portable wealth, or whether the Templars had prioritized preserving knowledge and objects that money couldn't replace. Other evidence points to coordinated evacuation beyond the naval operation. Templar houses outside France received visitors in the weeks before the arrests, men who arrived without announcement and left after brief consultations with local commanders. Shortly after these mysterious visits, Templars from those houses began dispersing, moving to locations in Spain, Portugal, Germany and Scotland, where Philip's authority didn't reach. It is as if coded warnings were sent through the network, instructions that certain members understood immediately while others remained unaware until arrest came. The source of the leak remains disputed. Philip had planned meticulously, limiting knowledge of the operation to a small circle of trusted officials. But secrets that valuable are difficult to protect completely. One theory suggests a member of Philip's court maintained loyalty to the Templars, perhaps someone who had used their financial services and felt obligation to an order that had served him well. Another possibility involves the Templars' own intelligence network. They operated as information brokers for 2 centuries, maintaining contacts in royal courts across Europe. Unusual activity around Templar properties increased surveillance, the movement of troops to positions near preceptories. These might have been enough for an organization trained in reading political situations to understand that something unprecedented was being planned. The most intriguing theory involves Pope Clement V himself. Despite publicly supporting Philip's actions, Clement may have sent private warnings to Templar leadership. He was caught between political necessity, maintaining French support, and genuine concern about destroying an order that had served the Church for 200 years. Several cryptic letters from the papal court to unknown recipients date from the weeks before the arrests, letters whose language suggests coded warnings rather than routine correspondence. If Clement did warn the Templars, he was playing a dangerous game, publicly supporting persecution while privately enabling escape, trying to satisfy Philip while preserving some fragment of an organization he could openly protect. What is certain is that the Templars had prepared for catastrophe, an organization that had survived 2 centuries in hostile territory, that had created the medieval world's most sophisticated financial and intelligence network. Wouldn't have lacked contingency plans for existential threats. They established safe houses, created emergency communication protocols, identified which members had knowledge too valuable to risk capture, and determined what assets absolutely had to be preserved, even if everything else was lost. When warning came, whether from external source or internal detection, these protocols activated with the efficiency you'd expect from a military order that had spent 200 years operating in crisis situations. The Templars who remained in France to face arrest were mostly ordinary members, knights and sergeants who handled daily operations but weren't privy to the order's deepest secrets. The Grand Masters, the treasurers, the scholars who maintained whatever knowledge had come from Jerusalem. Many of these crucial figures had quietly disappeared in the weeks before the 13th of October. Some were captured later, but by then they had time to hide what mattered most, to pass information to successors, to ensure that whatever the Templars actually were, whatever they actually knew, wouldn't be completely destroyed by Philip's conspiracy. When dawn broke on Friday the 13th and Philip's troops moved against Templar properties across France, they were executing a perfectly planned operation against an organization that had already executed its own plan for survival. Philip would capture thousands of Templars, he would seize enormous assets. He would torture confessions and burn heretics and dismantle the visible structure of the order. But the greatest treasures, the most important secrets, and the most knowledgeable members had already slipped through his fingers into darkness, heading for destinations where they wait and preserve, and eventually resurface in forms that Philip never anticipated. The conspiracy to destroy the Templars had succeeded. But the Templars' conspiracy to survive it had succeeded too, in ways that wouldn't become clear for centuries. Medieval torture wasn't designed to discover truth. It was designed to produce specific statements that interrogators had already decided they wanted to hear. The process was brutally simple. Tell the prisoner what to confess, apply pain until they say it, record their words as voluntary testimony. When Philip's inquisitors began processing captured Templars, they already knew what crimes they were looking for. The confessions that emerged weren't revelations. They were scripts performed under duress, with torture as the mechanism ensuring compliance. The accusations were shocking even by medieval standards. Templars allegedly denied Christ during secret initiation ceremonies, spitting on the cross 3 times while renouncing their saviour. They worshipped a mysterious severed head called Baphomet, described variously as bearded, skull-like, or possessing multiple faces. They engaged in ritual acts that violated Christian morality and natural law. They'd been corrupted by exposure to Muslim beliefs during their time in the East, abandoning Christianity while maintaining its appearance to deceive the faithful. These charges were calculated to horrify, to make the Templars seem not merely heretical, but actively demonic, deserving of the harshest punishment imaginable. But the confessions themselves tell a more complicated story than simple guilt or innocence. Many Templars initially confessed under torture, providing detailed descriptions of the ceremonies and practices their interrogators wanted documented. Then, when torture temporarily ceased, they recanted, denying everything they'd previously admitted. This pattern repeated across hundreds of trials. Confess under pain, recant when pain stopped, confess again when torture resumed. The consistency of this behavior suggests something beyond mere weakness under duress. Medieval law treated recantation after confession as proving that the original confession was true. Only the guilty would confess. The logic went, and recanting simply demonstrated their continued adherence to heresy. But it is equally possible that recantation was a way of signaling to observers, to fellow Templars who might hear about the trials, that the confessions were false, extracted through methods that invalidated their content. Some confessions contained elements so bizarre that they raise questions about whether Templars were deliberately inserting absurdities to undermine the proceedings. Descriptions of Baphomet varied wildly between different prisoners, suggesting either that no such object actually existed, or that prisoners were inventing details that couldn't be verified. References to initiation ceremonies included impossible elements, rituals that couldn't physically occur as described, locations that didn't match Templar architectural reality. Were these simply the confused testimonies of tortured men, or were they deliberate fabrications designed to signal that nothing being said should be trusted? Other confessions contained oddly specific details that seemed to serve no purpose in establishing guilt, but might have carried meaning for those who understood Templar internal communication. References to particular preceptories, mentions of ceremonies occurring on specific dates, descriptions of objects using terminology that seemed unnecessarily technical. These elements appeared with enough frequency to suggest possible coding. If Templars knew they were going to be tortured, if they'd prepared for this scenario as they seemed to have prepared for other contingencies, they might have developed methods for embedding real information in false confessions, telling interrogators what they wanted to hear while simultaneously communicating different messages to fellow Templars who would later read trial transcripts. The pattern of who confessed what reveals another layer of complexity. Ordinary Templars, those without access to the Order's inner hierarchy, generally provided consistent confessions matching what interrogators wanted. But high-ranking officers, those who would have known the Order's actual secrets, either refused to confess entirely or provided testimony so contradictory and strange that it complicated rather than confirmed the accusations. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, initially confessed under torture, but later recanted publicly, knowing this guaranteed his execution. His final statements from the scaffold have been analysed for centuries, seeking hidden meanings in his words about the Order's innocence and his predictions that Philip and Clement would soon face divine judgment. Some scholars argue that Molay's scaffold speech contained coded references to Templar survival plans, instructions for remaining members about where to find hidden assets or how to continue the Order's work under different guises. Others see his words as simple defiance, a broken man's final assertion of truth before death. The ambiguity is characteristic of everything surrounding the Templar trials. Every piece of evidence admits multiple interpretations. Every confession could be truth, lie, or coded message, depending on how you read it. What the trials definitely accomplished was serving multiple conspiracies simultaneously. Philip got confessions justifying his seizure of Templar assets and elimination of his creditors. The Church got evidence that allowed it to dissolve an organization that had become too powerful and independent. And possibly, the Templars themselves used the trials to protect whatever actually mattered to them, offering false confessions that satisfied interrogators while concealing real secrets, accepting martyrdom as the price of ensuring that knowledge, treasure, or organizational continuity survived their individual deaths. The curious fact remains that despite years of trials, thousands of interrogations, and extensive torture, certain questions never received clear answers. Where was the bulk of Templar wealth? What exactly were the secret ceremonies that even tortured Templars described inconsistently? What did the order actually believe and practice during its 2 centuries of existence? The trials produced volumes of testimony but very little reliable information, almost as if the entire proceeding had been designed to create the appearance of revelation while actually concealing more than it exposed. By 1314, when the last Templar leaders burned in Paris, Philip and Clement had achieved their immediate objectives. The order was destroyed as a public institution, its assets seized, its membership scattered. But the mysteries survive. The contradictions in trial records ensured that future generations would question what had really happened. And the possibility remained that while Philip had destroyed the organization, the Templars had successfully protected whatever they most valued, leaving behind confusion and coded messages that would keep their secrets safe long after everyone involved in the persecution had turned to dust. The official story ends with flames in Paris on the 18th of March 1314, when Jacques de Molay and the last Templar leaders burned at the stake. But organizations that have operated for 2 centuries across multiple continents don't simply vanish because one king decides they should cease to exist. The Templars who escaped France carried more than their lives into exile. They carried knowledge, organizational memory, financial resources, and connections that would allow them to continue their work under different names, in different forms, adapting to survival rather than announcing their continued existence. Portugal offered the most transparent example of Templar continuation. When papal bulls officially suppressed the order, King Dinas of Portugal conducted investigations and declared that Portuguese Templars were innocent of the charges that had destroyed their French counterparts. He then reorganized them under a new name, the Order of Christ. Same members, same properties, same organizational structure, different title. The papal suppression became a technicality rather than an actual dissolution. The Order of Christ retained the Templar cross as their symbol, maintained the preceptories and estates that Templars had built, and continued functioning as a military and financial organization, serving Portuguese interests. What makes this continuation particularly fascinating is what the Order of Christ accomplished in subsequent centuries. They became the primary sponsors of Portuguese maritime exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator was a Grand Master of the Order of Christ. The ships that sailed down the African coast, that rounded the Cape of Good Hope, that eventually reached India and Brazil, carried the Order of Christ's cross on their sails. Essentially the Templar cross sailing into waters that Europeans supposedly had never navigated before. If the Templars possessed advanced maritime knowledge, maps showing lands that would officially be discovered for decades, navigational techniques ahead of their time, the Order of Christ would have inherited this knowledge and used it to give Portugal advantages in the age of exploration that other kingdoms lacked. Scotland provided another refuge, though one more shadowy than Portugal's official reorganization. King Robert the Bruce was excommunicated and under papal interdict during the period of Templar suppression, making Scotland essentially outside church jurisdiction. Templars fleeing persecution found a kingdom where papal bulls carried no weight, and a king who valued skilled warriors and financial expertise. Evidence of Templar presence in Scotland appears in architectural features of certain churches and castles built in the decades after 1307, structures incorporating symbolic elements and geometric principles characteristic of Templar building traditions. The Rosslyn Chapel, constructed in the 15th century, contains carvings that scholars have argued represent Templar knowledge, including botanical details of plants from the Americas decades before Columbus' voyage. If those interpretations are correct, they suggest that Templar maritime knowledge survived in Scotland and included information about Western lands. Other Templars dispersed throughout Europe, finding protection in regions where local rulers valued their skills more than they feared papal displeasure. In Germany, several minor knights joined the Teutonic Order, bringing Templar organizational methods and financial practices with them. In Spain, Templar knights merged with existing military orders fighting in the Reconquista, their expertise absorbed into organizations that continued operating openly. In Switzerland, some evidence suggests Templars contributed to the development of the Swiss banking tradition, though the connections are harder to document definitively than the Portuguese case. The more intriguing question involves how Templar knowledge and organizational structure survived beyond formal military orders. Craft guilds, particularly stonemasons, began showing characteristics remarkably similar to Templar internal organization in the decades following suppression. Initiatic rituals, hierarchical degrees of knowledge, oaths of secrecy, symbolic systems that went beyond practical craftwork. These elements appeared with increasing sophistication in guild structures during the 14th and 15th centuries. Whether this represented Templars deliberately infiltrating guilds as cover for continued operation, or guilds adopting successful organizational models from a disbanded order, the result was preservation of Templar methods in institutions that faced no persecution. By the 17th century, proto-Masonic organizations were emerging in Scotland and England with structures, symbolism, and philosophical foundations that bore striking resemblances to what we know about Templar internal organization. Masonic tradition explicitly claims connection to medieval stonemasons, but also includes degrees and ceremonies referencing Templar history and symbolism. Whether this represents actual continuity, a direct line from Templars through craft guilds to Freemasonry, or whether later Masons simply adopted Templar imagery because of its mystique remains debated. But the patterns are suggestive enough that tracing influence becomes plausible, even if proving direct descent remains difficult. The Templars also survived culturally in ways that transcended organizational continuity. They became legendary figures in European consciousness, associated with hidden treasure, secret knowledge, and mysterious power. This legendization actually enhanced their influence. Every unsolved mystery, every cache of ancient documents, every instance of unexplained wealth or knowledge got attributed to Templar survival. The Order's destruction made them more powerful in imagination than they might have been if they simply continued openly. Philip had tried to eliminate them and instead had created immortal figures who would inspire speculation, investigation, and imitation for centuries. What we can document definitively is that Templar knowledge didn't die in 1314. Maritime expertise that contributed to exploration, financial methods that influenced banking development, architectural principles that appeared in later constructions, organizational structures that resembled Templar hierarchy. These things survived whether or not any formal Templar organization continued. The order had been too large, too distributed, too deeply embedded in medieval economic and political structures to be completely eradicated by even the most thorough persecution. The Templars who escaped France played a long game. They didn't attempt to reconstitute their order publicly. They didn't fight Philip or seek revenge against the Church. Instead, they adapted, merged, transformed, and persisted. Some joined other organizations and influenced them from within. Some founded new institutions that pursued similar objectives under different names. Some simply preserved knowledge and passed it to successors who would use it generations later. They understood that survival sometimes requires invisibility, that influence can persist without formal structure, that an organization's death can be the beginning of something more resilient than what existed before. By the time the Age of Exploration began, Templar ships had been gone for more than a century, but the cross they carried appeared on Portuguese sails venturing into unknown waters. The knowledge they accumulated guided navigators whose charts showed lands that shouldn't exist yet, and the organizational genius they developed lived on in institutions that would shape the modern world, bearing different names but carrying forward methods and purposes that traced back to 9 knights digging beneath a ruined temple in Jerusalem, searching for something that would make them, and their successors, powerful enough to survive anything that medieval kings and popes could devise to destroy them. The Templars spent 2 centuries stationed at the intersection of 3 civilizations, Christian, Islamic, and Jewish, during a period when each possessed knowledge the others lacked. While European Christianity struggled with theological debates and limited its intellectual inquiry to what served church doctrine, Islamic scholars had preserved and expanded upon Greek mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Jewish communities maintained mystical traditions and textual interpretations that predated Christianity. The Templars, uniquely positioned in the Holy Land with the military power to operate independently and the wealth to pursue interests beyond simple warfare, had access to all of this and the intelligence to recognize its value. Their banking system alone demonstrated mathematical sophistication that European finance wouldn't match for centuries. The encryption methods they developed for securing financial transactions employed principles that modern cryptographers recognize as precursors to techniques formally discovered much later. They created what was essentially the first international banking network, requiring standardized accounting across multiple kingdoms, conversion between different currency systems, and secure communication of financial information across vast distances. This wasn't simple bookkeeping. It was applied mathematics at a level that suggests exposure to advanced numerical systems, possibly from Islamic sources where algebra and sophisticated calculation methods had been developing for centuries. Templar architecture showed similar advancement. The fortresses they built in the Holy Land incorporated engineering principles that shouldn't have been available to medieval European builders. Geometric relationships in their constructions demonstrate understanding of mathematical harmonies that would become explicit in European architectural theory until the Renaissance. Some researchers examining Templar buildings have identified proportions matching the golden ratio and other mathematical constants that medieval European builders supposedly didn't know how to calculate or apply deliberately. Whether the Templars learned these principles from Islamic architects, discovered them in ancient texts, or developed them through their own experimentation, the result was architectural knowledge that exceeded what their contemporaries possessed. Then there are the maps. Persistent legends describe Templar possession of charts showing lands that Europeans wouldn't officially discover for another 2 centuries. The famous Piri-Reis map from 1513, which appears to show Antarctica's coastline before it was covered by ice, supposedly drew on ancient sources, including maps captured from Templars. The Portolan charts that enabled Mediterranean navigation with surprising accuracy began appearing in the 13th century, during the height of Templar power, showing coastal details that shouldn't have been available without systematic surveying far beyond what any known expedition had conducted. If the Templars had access to ancient Roman or even earlier maps, if they conducted their own systematic maritime exploration, if their network spanning 3 continents allowed them to compile geographic knowledge that no single kingdom possessed, their navigational understanding would have far exceeded what history officially credits them with knowing. Their exposure to multiple medical and scientific traditions gave them practical knowledge that conventional medieval medicine lacked. Islamic physicians had preserved Greek medical texts and expanded on them, developing surgical techniques and pharmaceutical knowledge that Christian Europe had lost. Jewish physicians moved between Islamic and Christian territories, carrying medical learning with them. Templars maintaining contact with both traditions would have accessed healing methods far more effective than what contemporary European practitioners employed. Evidence suggests that Templar medical care was remarkably successful for its time, with survival rates from injuries that would be fatal in ordinary medieval treatment contexts. More controversial are suggestions that Templars possessed alchemical and metallurgical knowledge beyond the conventional medieval understanding. Some accounts describe Templar weapons and armor as being of exceptional quality, suggesting advanced metalworking techniques. Alchemical texts attributed to Templar sources contain chemical processes that indicate genuine understanding of material transformation, rather than mere mysticism. Whether they learned these methods from Islamic alchemists, discovered them in ancient Greek or Arabic manuscripts, or developed them through their own experimentation, the result was practical knowledge of chemistry that European natural philosophy wouldn't formally develop for centuries. The philosophical and theological knowledge Templars encountered was perhaps most dangerous and most carefully preserved. Contact with Islamic philosophy exposed them to Aristotelian logic and Greek philosophy that had been banned or forgotten in Christian Europe. Jewish Kabbalistic traditions offered mystical interpretations that challenged orthodox Christian theology. Gnostic texts surviving in Middle Eastern communities presented alternative versions of Christian origins and teaching. For an organization operating with papal protection but increasing independence, this exposure to diverse intellectual traditions would have been simultaneously enlightening and compromising, valuable knowledge that could be openly acknowledged without inviting accusations of heresy. How did this knowledge survive the order's suppression? Some was encoded in documents that appeared to be routine financial or administrative records, but contained layered meanings accessible only to initiates who knew the codes. Some was embedded in architectural features of buildings. The Templars constructed geometric and symbolic information, literally carved in stone, where it would outlast any manuscript. Some was transmitted through initiatic ceremonies and oral traditions, master teaching student across generations without ever writing the most sensitive material, and some was simply given to successor organizations, the Order of Christ, craft guilds, proto-Masonic groups, who preserved it while sometimes forgetting its origins. Evidence of this preserved knowledge appears in unexpected contexts during the Renaissance and Scientific Revolution. Advanced mathematics surfacing in European scholarship often has suspicious gaps in its provenance, as if it arrived from sources that could be acknowledged. Philosophical ideas that challenged medieval orthodoxy sometimes appeared fully formed, suggesting they'd been developing in hidden contexts rather than being suddenly invented. Navigational and geographic knowledge that enabled the age of exploration exceeded what official European learning should have provided, pointing to preserved information from older sources. The possibility remains that some Templar knowledge has never been recovered. Archives that were hidden in 1307 might still exist in forgotten repositories. Documents that appear to be mundane medieval records might contain encoded information that modern researchers haven't recognized. Buildings and artifacts might incorporate symbolic systems that we can see but not yet interpret. The Templars had 2 centuries to accumulate knowledge and decades of warning that persecution was coming. What they chose to preserve and how they chose to hide it might still be revealing itself in discoveries that won't be made for generations, in codes that won't be broken, until someone finally asks the right questions about manuscripts that have been sitting in plain sight for 700 years, waiting for someone who knows what they're actually looking at. The Templars operated in plain sight for 2 centuries, becoming the most visible secret organization of the medieval world. But visibility doesn't mean isolation. Beneath their public profile existed connections to other groups, other networks, other conspiracies that shared similar interests, even when they pursued different objectives. The medieval shadow world wasn't a single conspiracy, but an ecology of interconnected organizations, each maintaining its own secrets while participating in a larger system of alternative knowledge and power that transcended any individual group. Evidence of these connections appears in surprising places. Templar correspondence includes letters to Sufi mystics in the Islamic world, exchanges that went far beyond diplomatic courtesy into genuine philosophical discussion. These weren't the communications you'd expect from Christian crusaders supposedly dedicated to fighting Islam. They suggest mutual recognition between organizations that understood themselves as pursuing similar esoteric knowledge despite operating in different religious contexts. The language used in these letters hints at shared symbolic systems, common understanding of mystical traditions that transcended the religious divisions that defined public medieval politics. Jewish merchant networks maintained business relationships with Templars that went beyond simple financial transactions. Certain Jewish families served as intermediaries between Templar houses and Islamic territories, carrying not just goods but information that wouldn't flow through official Christian or Muslim channels. These relationships created communication pathways that connected otherwise isolated communities of alternative thinking. A scholar in Toledo could access ideas from Baghdad through Jewish merchants who maintained contacts with Templars who had relationships with Sufi orders. Knowledge moved through these networks in ways that official histories never recorded because the networks themselves operated outside structures that generated official records. Alchemical societies, loosely organized groups of natural philosophers pursuing chemical and spiritual transformation, had overlapping membership with Templar houses in certain regions. Evidence suggests that some Templars studied alchemical texts, that some alchemists found protection in Templar preceptories. that the two groups recognized each other as pursuing complementary aspects of hidden knowledge. The connections weren't formal alliances, but rather organic relationships between people who understood that they represented different expressions of similar impulses toward knowledge that mainstream medieval society suppressed. Geographic patterns reveal how these networks operated across time. Certain locations became persistent centers of esoteric activity, regardless of which political or religious authority nominally controlled them. The Languedoc region in southern France was home to Cathars, Templar strongholds, alchemical schools, and Jewish mystical communities, often simultaneously and with evidence of interaction between them. When the Albigensian Crusade destroyed the Cathars, Templar presence remained. When Philip suppressed the Templars, other groups absorbed survivors and continued activities. The location mattered more than any single organization because the geography itself facilitated certain kinds of activity, remote enough to avoid constant oversight, positioned on trade routes that brought diverse people and ideas together, mountainous terrain that provided literal and figurative refuge. Certain families appear repeatedly in leadership positions across multiple secret organizations, spanning centuries. A noble house might produce Templar commanders, Cathar prefects, alchemical patrons, and later Masonic leaders, suggesting that some bloodlines maintained commitments to alternative traditions across generations, passing not just wealth and titles but esoteric knowledge and organizational connections. These families operated within official medieval society, holding conventional positions and public roles, while simultaneously participating in networks that challenged or circumvented orthodox power structures. The network's resilience came from its distributed nature. When one node was destroyed, others absorbed its function. When the Templars fell, craft guilds preserved their organizational methods. When the Cathars were exterminated, their ideas survived in alchemical symbolism and heretical texts hidden in monasteries. The conspiracy ecology adapted to pressure, evolved under persecution, and maintained continuity through transformation rather than static survival. No single suppression could destroy the entire network because no authority understood the network's full extent or recognized how seemingly unrelated groups actually functioned as parts of a larger system. This wasn't coordinated in the modern sense of a single directing intelligence planning everything. It was more organic, more like how medieval trade routes emerged from individual decisions that collectively created economic infrastructure no one had explicitly designed. Groups with similar interests naturally found each other, protected each other when possible, shared knowledge that served mutual purposes, and collectively maintained alternatives to dominant institutions without requiring formal alliances or explicit coordination. What we call the Renaissance and Enlightenment might be better understood as moments when this underground network had accumulated enough strength and legitimacy to emerge into public view. Ideas that had been circulating in secret societies for centuries suddenly became respectable scholarship. Organizational methods developed by secret orders became models for public institutions. Knowledge preserved by heretical networks became the foundation of new sciences. The surfacing wasn't sudden creation, but rather revelation of what had long existed in hidden form. The Templars were one bright thread in this tapestry, visible because of their wealth and power, dramatic because of their suppression. But they were never alone. They operated within an ecology of secret knowledge and alternative power that included groups whose names we know and others that left no clear traces. Understanding Templar history means understanding this larger network, recognizing that medieval conspiracy wasn't aberration but structure, not isolated incidents but ongoing condition. The shadow world where the Templars lived was crowded with others who shared their understanding that official history was incomplete, that dominant institutions didn't hold all truth, that alternative traditions maintained values and knowledge worth protecting even at the cost of everything visible and conventional. Medieval kingship rested on a simple principle. God chose rulers through bloodlines, passing sovereignty from father to son in an unbroken chain that stretched back to biblical times. Kings ruled by divine right, their authority flowing through sacred blood that ordinary people didn't possess. The entire structure of medieval society depended on this belief. Nobles owed loyalty to kings because of their bloodlines. Peasants accepted their station because hierarchy reflected divine order. The system worked only as long as everyone believed that the people on thrones actually belonged there, that their blood genuinely carried the authority they claimed. But medieval Europe had a problem that no amount of ceremony or theological justification could fully conceal. Many of the people sitting on thrones had no legitimate right to be there. Their blood wasn't royal, their claims were fabrications. They were bastards, impostors, or the descendants of bastards and impostors, wearing crowns that should have belonged to others if bloodline actually mattered the way official doctrine insisted it did. William the Conqueror offers the most obvious example precisely because his illegitimacy was too well known to hide completely. He was called William the Bastard throughout his early life, the son of Robert, Duke of Normandy, and a woman named Harleva, whose exact status remains disputed. Some sources call her a concubine. Others suggest she was lower nobility, but none claim she was Robert's legitimate wife. William's path to becoming Duke of Normandy involved violence and political maneuvering, precisely because his illegitimate birth made his claim questionable. When he conquered England in 1066, he transformed from William the Bastard into William the Conqueror, rewriting his narrative through successful violence. But the blood that supposedly gave him divine right to rule England was the same blood that made him a bastard in Normandy, legitimate only because he de-accumulated enough power that no one could safely question it. The English royal succession provides even more disturbing examples of bloodline manipulation. Evidence examined by modern historians suggests that Edward IV, who ruled England from 1461 to 1483, might not have been the legitimate son of Richard, Duke of York. Contemporary sources hint that his mother had an affair with an archer, while his supposed father was away at war. If these allegations were true, then Edward IV was illegitimate, which meant his children had no legitimate claim, which meant the entire Tudor dynasty that followed, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, the monarchs who defined English history for more than a century, were all ruling without the divine bloodline that supposedly justified their authority. These weren't isolated cases, but rather endemic conditions. Court insiders knew things that could be publicly acknowledged. Queens had affairs with trusted courtiers. Kings fathered children who weren't their legal heirs. Powerful nobles arranged royal marriages, but ensured that consummation occurred under circumstances that made actual paternity uncertain. The medieval court was a place of constant sexual intrigue, not just because medieval people were particularly promiscuous, but because sex and reproduction were political acts with consequences that shaped kingdoms. A queen who birthed a child after an affair hadn't just committed adultery. She de-inserted false blood into the royal line, undermining the entire theological justification for monarchy. The sophisticated methods used to obscure these realities deserve recognition. Genealogies were living documents, constantly revised to serve current political needs. Inconvenient ancestors disappeared from family trees. Convenient ones were invented or borrowed from other bloodlines. Entire branches of royal descent could be grafted onto family histories, with nothing more than a few altered manuscripts and complicit chroniclers willing to write what powerful patrons needed written. Documentation was limited enough that determined conspirators could reshape bloodlines with relatively little fear that contradictory evidence would surface. When concealment wasn't possible, babies were attributed to different parents entirely. A child born from an affair might be claimed by a loyal noble willing to raise the royal bastard as his own legitimate heir. A queen's pregnancy might be hidden, the child given away or killed, replaced by another infant whose parentage was more convenient. The elaborate rituals around royal births, the witnesses, the formal announcements, the immediate christening, weren't just ceremony. They were mechanisms attempting to establish paternity in a world where biological reality could be hidden and powerful people had overwhelming incentives to manipulate who counted as legitimate royal blood. Foreign powers and domestic rivals maintained careful records of these secrets, treating knowledge of illegitimacy as strategic assets. An ambassador who learned that a prince was actually a bastard possessed information worth more than military intelligence. A noble family that had witnessed a queen's affair held leverage that could be deployed years later when that queen's son sat on the throne. These secrets were currencies in the hidden economy of medieval power, traded carefully, revealed strategically, and protected because their value depended on controlling when and whether they became public knowledge. The psychological burden of ruling under such circumstances shaped medieval kingship in profound ways. Many rulers knew their claims were questionable. They lived with the constant fear that someone would reveal the truth, that subjects who had sworn loyalty would learn their oaths had been given to someone with no legitimate right to receive them. This paranoia wasn't irrational. It was accurate assessment of genuine vulnerability. The people closest to medieval kings, their mothers, their wives, their most trusted advisors, often knew secrets that could destroy them. Loyalty under those circumstances was never certain, and betrayal was always one careless word away. The system persisted despite these fundamental contradictions because enough powerful people had incentives to maintain the fiction. Nobles who held power under questionable kings would lose that power if legitimacy was investigated too carefully. Church officials who blessed royal authority didn't want to acknowledge that divine right was actually political convenience. Foreign rulers who had treaties with monarchs of dubious blood couldn't undermine them without calling their own legitimacy into question, since nearly every royal house had similar secrets in its lineage. The conspiracy to maintain belief in bloodline legitimacy was perhaps medieval Europe's most successful collective deception, requiring coordinated silence from thousands of people who knew the truth but understood that speaking it would destroy the entire system, themselves included. Medieval monarchy was theatre built on lies about blood. The people wearing crowns often knew they were actors playing roles they hadn't legitimately inherited. The people supporting those monarchs often knew the same truth, but found it more profitable to pretend belief than to speak honestly. And the masses who genuinely believed in divine right and sacred bloodlines were the only ones not conspiring, the only ones who took literally what everyone with real power understood was convenient fiction. The greatest medieval conspiracy wasn't any single deception, but rather the collective maintenance of a system that everyone at the top knew was fraudulent, while everyone at the bottom was taught to consider it sacred and unquestionable truth flowing directly from God's will through the pure blood of kings who were, as often as not, the children of affairs. Deceptions and political arrangements that had nothing to do with divine selection or sacred inheritance. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, never wore England's crown, but for more than a decade during the Wars of the Roses he decided who would. He made Edward IV king in 1461, supporting the Yorkist claim and providing the military force that put Edward on the throne. Then, when Edward began making decisions Warwick didn't approve, Warwick switched sides, briefly restored the Lancastrian Henry Voy to power in 1470, and only lost his king-making authority when he died in battle in 1471. History remembers him as Warwick the Kingmaker, a title that acknowledged what everyone at the time understood. The person with the crown was less important than the person who decided which head would wear it. Warwick wasn't too unique. He was simply the most visible example of a phenomenon that defined medieval politics. Real power didn't necessarily correlate with official position. The people who actually controlled succession, who decided which bloodline would rule and which would be eliminated, often operated from positions that appeared subordinate to the throne. They were advisors, not monarchs, cardinals, not popes. Nobles who commanded resources and loyalty that kings nominally ruled but actually depended upon for survival. The mechanisms of king-making varied by context but shared common elements. Control of resources was fundamental. Whoever supplied the gold that paid armies, the grain that fed populations, the credit that financed government operations, held leverage that nominal authority could overcome. Military force mattered, but not always in obvious ways. A noble who could field an army didn't need to use it if the king understood that resistance would trigger violence. The threat was often sufficient, making actual warfare unnecessary, except when multiple kingmakers competed for the same prize. Information was another currency of king-making power. Spy masters who knew everyone's secrets, who understood which nobles were planning betrayal, which heirs had questionable legitimacy, which foreign powers were offering support to rival claimants, possessed advantages that could make or break succession struggles. A kingmaker who knew that a candidate's mother had birthed him during an affair, that a rival claimant was negotiating with enemy kingdoms, that a young prince's advisor was actually a foreign agent, could deploy this information strategically, revealing secrets at moments that destroyed opponents while protecting favored candidates. Less visible but equally effective were the kingmakers who operated in private spaces. Royal mistresses influenced decisions in bedchambers where formal advisors never entered. A king might resist pressure from his council, but accept guidance whispered by a woman he loved or desired. These influences were difficult to document and easy to dismiss, which made them effective precisely because they operated beneath the attention of official political observers. When a king made decisions that seemed irrational to his formal advisors, the explanation sometimes lay in counsel received in contexts where policy and pillow talk merged indistinguishably. Court physicians and astrologers wielded different but significant forms of king-making power. A physician could declare an heir mentally or physically unfit to rule, removing candidates from succession through medical authority rather than political conflict. An astrologer whose predictions were respected by superstitious royalty could guide decisions by framing options as divinely favored or cosmically doomed. These figures operated at the intersection of legitimate expertise and political manipulation, using specialized knowledge to advance agendas while maintaining appearances of objective professional judgment. The negotiations that actually determined succession often occurred in settings far removed from public ceremony. While armies marched and heralds announced claims, kingmakers met in private chambers to arrange the real decisions. A midnight conversation between powerful nobles might settle who would wear the crown, while the official claimants remained ignorant of agreements made in their names. Public conflict was sometimes theatre performed for masses who believed battles determined succession, while the actual outcome had been negotiated before anyone drew a sword. Certain families developed king-making as a generational specialty, maintaining influence regardless of which dynasty held formal power. They achieved this by avoiding the throne itself, understanding that kings made targets while advisors enjoyed power with less vulnerability. By positioning family members as essential counselors, treasurers, and coordinators across multiple generations, these houses became permanent fixtures of royal governance, while individual monarchs rose and fell. Their power derived not from bloodline claims to rule, but from institutional knowledge, accumulated relationships, and resources that kings needed but couldn't replicate. The psychology of king-making involved constant tension between power and danger. Kingmakers wielded enormous influence but faced existential risks when kings decided to eliminate those who knew too much or had become too powerful. Many kingmakers ended on scaffolds or in dungeons, destroyed by the rulers they'd installed, once those rulers felt secure enough to remove their creators. The smart ones maintained careful balance, remaining essential but not threatening, powerful but not independent enough to provoke preemptive elimination. It was a delicate position, requiring constant calibration of how much influence to exercise openly versus how much to conceal. Medieval monarchy was performance art with kingmakers as unseen directors. The crowned figures who appeared in paintings and official histories were often actors reading scripts, making gestures, and delivering lines that others had written. The real authors of royal policy, the actual wielders of sovereign power, maintained positions backstage where they controlled outcomes while avoiding spotlight that brought both glory and danger. They understood that the throne was the most dangerous seat in the kingdom, while the chairs behind it, invisible to crowds cheering coronations and mourning royal funerals, were where power actually lived. History recorded the names of kings while kingmakers wrote that history, ensuring that their own roles remained obscure enough to protect them from the consequences of visibility, while clear enough to those who mattered that their influence shaped everything that happened under the cover of legitimate bloodline succession and divine right that everyone pretended to believe in. The hunting accident was a medieval classic. A noble or prince riding through forest, separated momentarily from his companions, struck by an arrow that came from uncertain direction. By the time others arrived, he was dead or dying, and the archer was nowhere to be found. These deaths were officially recorded as tragic accidents, inevitable risks of a dangerous sport. But people at court understood differently. They knew that hunting parties offered perfect opportunities for assassination. Weapons were expected, deaths could be explained, and forests provided cover for killers who vanished into trees that all looked identical to later investigators. Edward II of England died in Berkeley Castle in 1327 under circumstances so suspicious that historians still debate whether he was murdered or somehow survived to live in exile. The official cause was natural illness, but contemporary rumours described a far more brutal death, involving heated instruments applied in ways designed to leave no external marks. Whether those rumors were true or propaganda meant to horrify enemies of those who deposed him, the fact remains that Edward's death was extraordinarily convenient for his wife Isabella and her lover Mortimer, who had seized power and needed the inconvenient king permanently removed. The princes in the Tower represent perhaps the most famous case of convenient royal death. Edward V and his younger brother Richard disappeared while imprisoned in the Tower of London in 1483, last seen in late summer before vanishing from all records. Their uncle, Richard III, who had assumed the throne, became the primary suspect in what most historians believe was murder designed to eliminate rival claimants. The bodies supposedly discovered centuries later buried beneath a staircase suggest that someone did indeed kill the boys, though exactly who ordered their deaths and whether Richard was truly responsible remains disputed. What is undeniable is that their disappearance solved Richard's legitimacy problem by removing the only serious challengers to his claim. Medieval poisoning had evolved into a sophisticated art. Certain toxins produced symptoms that mimicked dysentery, plague, or common fevers, making poison deaths nearly indistinguishable from natural illness in an era when medical understanding was limited and autopsies were rare. Arsenic administered gradually could create a decline that looked like wasting disease. Certain plant extracts caused heart failure that appeared natural in aging or stressed individuals. The poisonous advantage was that medieval medicine attributed illness to humoral imbalances or divine punishment rather than investigating external causes, making suspicious deaths easy to explain away as God's will or natural misfortune. Some courts maintained specialists in death, individuals whose official positions masked their actual function. A trusted physician might double as an assassin, using medical access to royal personages to administer poison disguised as medicine. A food taster, supposedly protecting the king, might be complicit in plots, knowing which dishes to avoid while allowing poisoned food to reach its target. These positions of trust became vehicles for betrayal precisely because trust granted access that outsiders could achieve. Investigation of royal deaths followed patterns determined by political convenience rather than truth. Seeking. When powerful nobles wanted a death attributed to natural causes, the official inquiry confirmed natural causes regardless of evidence. Witnesses who saw things that contradicted convenient narratives could be bribed into silence, intimidated into forgetfulness, or permanently silenced if neither bribery nor intimidation succeeded. The people conducting investigations often had relationships with those who benefited from the death, making objective inquiry impossible, even if anyone had genuinely wanted truth rather than politically useful conclusions. Court insiders developed sophisticated understanding of which deaths were accidents and which were assassinations disguised as accidents. A prince dying conveniently just before a political crisis resolved itself raised immediate suspicions. An heir, sudden illness occurring days after defying a powerful noble, was transparently murder to anyone paying attention. But speaking these suspicions aloud was extraordinarily dangerous. The person asking too many questions about suspicious royal deaths might find themselves suffering a convenient accident, their curiosity permanently cured by the same mechanisms they'd been investigating. This created an atmosphere where silence became survival strategy. Everyone at court knew certain truths that couldn't be spoken. They watched murders happen in slow motion, the careful positioning of targets, the preparation of circumstances, the execution of plans that everyone understood but no one acknowledged. The tacit complicity of this silence enabled systematic assassination as a tool of medieval politics, transforming courts into environments where royalty lived under constant threat from the people closest to them. Succession disputes sometimes became assassination races, with multiple factions attempting to eliminate rival claimants faster than their own candidates could be killed. These shadow wars ran parallel to public political maneuvering, with each side trying to reduce the opposing roster of potential rulers while protecting their own. The faction that successfully killed more opponents faster often won succession struggles regardless of legal claims or popular support, proving that medieval politics ultimately rested on violence or threat of violence more than any principle of legitimate bloodline inheritance. Paranoia wasn't a character flaw for medieval royalty. It was rational assessment of genuine threat. Kings employed food tasters who ate samples of every dish before the royal meal. They surrounded themselves with bodyguards whose loyalty had been tested through years of service. They varied their routines to prevent predictability that assassins could exploit. They suspected everyone because suspicion was appropriate when the people most likely to kill you were those closest to you, family members who wanted your throne, advisors who had been bribed by rivals, servants who feared or hated you enough to accept payment for murder. The convenience of so many royal deaths was remarkable only if you believed official explanations. If you understood that medieval succession was determined by whoever could eliminate rivals most effectively while making those eliminations appear natural or accidental, then the pattern made perfect sense. Assassination wasn't an aberration in medieval politics. It was standard procedure, a tool used so routinely that courts developed specialized expertise in both executing murders and concealing them beneath narratives of misfortune and divine will, that the masses accepted because they couldn't imagine the systematic, calculated nature of how power actually eliminated obstacles to its own perpetuation and transfer. A Venetian merchant arriving in Constantinople in 1250 carried more than silk and spices. He carried questions that his trading mission made perfectly natural to ask. How was the Byzantine emperor's health? Were there tensions between the palace and the military? What were grain prices, and did that suggest coming shortages that might destabilize the region? Which noble families were accumulating wealth and which were selling assets in ways that suggested financial distress? These questions served commercial purposes. A trader needed to understand markets and political stability, but the same information reported back to Venice through merchant correspondence became intelligence that shaped Venetian foreign policy, military planning, and diplomatic strategy. Medieval merchants were the perfect spies precisely because they weren't supposed to be spies at all. They traveled openly across borders that divided kingdoms and religions, carrying legitimate business that explained their presence anywhere goods were bought or sold. They spoke multiple languages out of commercial necessity, allowing them to gather information in settings where monolingual diplomatic envoys would be excluded. They had reasons to cultivate relationships with local nobles, administrators, and other merchants, creating networks of contacts that could be exploited for intelligence gathering without raising suspicion. And they needed accurate information to make profitable decisions, giving them motivation to develop reliable intelligence methods independent of any espionage purposes. The major merchant families and trading companies understood this dual function explicitly. The Medici banking empire that would eventually dominate Florence operated branches across Europe and the Mediterranean, each branch embedded in local commercial and political networks. Information flowed through these branches alongside money, reports about political situations, assessments of which rulers were stable and which were vulnerable, intelligence about military preparations that might disrupt trade routes or create opportunities for profitable loans. The Medici used this information to guide their own business decisions, but they also sold it to political clients, served it to diplomatic partners, and deployed it to advance family interests that transcended simple profit-seeking. German Hanseatic League traders created perhaps medieval Europe's most sophisticated commercial intelligence network, operating across the Baltic and North Seas through hundreds of trading posts from London to Novgorod. Hanseatic merchants gathered information about economic conditions, political developments, and military activities across a vast geographic area. The League used this intelligence collectively, coordinating trading strategies and political interventions based on information that no single kingdom could match. When Hanseatic merchants decided to embargo a city that had violated their privileges, they did so with precise understanding of that city's economic vulnerabilities, knowledge gathered through years of intelligence accumulation, disguised as routine commercial activity. The intelligence flowing through merchant networks wasn't just passively collected observations. Merchants actively shaped information environments, spreading rumors that served their interests, suppressing news that might disadvantage their operations, and manipulating how political actors understood situations in ways that created opportunities for commercial or political exploitation. A merchant who spread rumors about an impending grain shortage could drive up prices in regions where he already stockpiled supplies. Information about a noble's financial difficulties, carefully leaked to competitors, could trigger a cascade of credit withdrawals that bankrupted the target while enriching those who depositioned themselves to profit from the collapse. Merchant codes and business correspondence evolved to serve dual purposes. A letter discussing textile shipments and payment schedules might contain, encoded within routine commercial language, intelligence about military movements or political conspiracies. Modern historians examining medieval merchant archives have identified patterns in correspondence that suggest information beyond the literal commercial content. Though decoding these messages centuries later remains challenging when the keys and contexts have been lost. The merchants themselves developed increasingly sophisticated methods for embedding sensitive intelligence in documents that would pass inspection by customs officials or hostile authorities who might intercept correspondence. Marital alliances extended merchant intelligence networks across generations and geography. A Florentine banking family marrying a daughter into German merchant aristocracy created a permanent intelligence link between Italian and German commercial network. The daughter maintained loyalty to her birth family while gaining intimate access to her husband's business operations and political connections. Her correspondence home, ostensibly family letters, could transmit intelligence that formal diplomatic channels would never access. Multiplied across dozens of merchant families pursuing similar strategies, these marital networks created an intelligence web that spanned Europe and extended into Byzantine and Islamic territories, connecting information sources that official state intelligence systems couldn't coordinate. The accuracy of merchant intelligence often exceeded official diplomatic reporting because merchants faced immediate consequences for bad information. A diplomat who misread a political situation might write inaccurate reports without facing personal financial loss. A merchant who made bad decisions based on flawed intelligence lost money, possibly catastrophic amounts if the mistakes were severe enough. This created market-based quality control for intelligence gathering. Merchants who consistently understood situations accurately prospered and expanded their networks, while those who misread situations declined in wealth and influence. The result was that kingdoms and city-states often learned more from cultivating merchant sources than from their own formal intelligence services. Some merchant families evolved into essentially permanent intelligence contractors, serving multiple clients simultaneously and maintaining carefully balanced relationships with competing powers. A Genoese merchant might sell intelligence to both French and Aragonese courts, calibrating what he revealed to each client to maximize the value of his services, while avoiding betraying either patrons so completely that he lost their business. This required sophisticated understanding of what each client needed to know, what they already knew from other sources, and what revelations would be valuable enough to justify payment without being so significant that they'd make the merchant himself dangerous to his client's interests. The medieval world's economic integration created information infrastructure that transcended political boundaries and often operated independently of state control. Merchants needed this infrastructure to function commercially, but its existence meant that information of all kinds, commercial, political, military, and personal, flowed along trade routes faster and more reliably than through official channels. Kings might control armies and bishops might control souls, but merchants controlled something potentially more powerful. They controlled knowledge about what was actually happening beyond any single kingdom's borders, and they used that knowledge to accumulate wealth and influence that made them indispensable partners and dangerous opponents to the political powers who nominally ruled medieval Europe. By the late medieval period, the distinction between merchant and spy had become meaningless for major trading families. They were both simultaneously gathering intelligence as naturally as they gathered profit, using information as currency alongside gold and goods, and operating an international system of knowledge exchange that shaped political decisions across the medieval world. Diplomats and kings might make formal agreements, but merchants knew whether those agreements would hold, what the real financial situations were behind public proclamations, and which way power was actually shifting beneath the ceremonies and proclamations that everyone else mistook for political reality. The merchant spies didn't wear disguises or work in shadows. They operated in plain sight, moving valuable cargo that everyone could see while carrying even more valuable information that everyone needed, but few understood was being systematically collected, analyzed, and deployed by networks that answered to no single sovereign and pursued agendas that transcended any individual kingdom's interests. In 1348, as the Black Death swept through Europe, killing perhaps a third of the population, groups of men began appearing in towns and cities, engaging in public acts of extreme penance. They stripped to the waist and whipped themselves with leather scourges tipped with metal, drawing blood while singing hymns and crying out for God's mercy. These were the flagellants, and they believed that the plague was divine punishment for human sin that could only be stopped through radical acts of suffering and repentance. But beneath the religious performance lay something more threatening to established authority, a movement that rejected the Church's claim to mediate between humanity and God, that organized itself without clerical oversight, and that spread across Europe with speed that terrified both secular and religious powers. The flagellants weren't seeking to reform the Church or crown a new king. They wanted to transform reality itself, to hasten the apocalypse that would destroy the corrupt world and establish God's kingdom on earth. Their movement crossed borders freely. Flagellant groups moved from Italy to Germany to France, ignoring political boundaries that meant nothing to people convinced that earthly kingdoms were about to end. They attracted followers from all social classes, but particularly from the desperate and dispossessed, people who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from the complete destruction of existing social structures. What made apocalyptic movements genuinely terrifying to medieval authorities was their complete rejection of negotiation or compromise. You could negotiate with nobles seeking more power, offer them lands or titles. You could negotiate with heretics disputing theology, offer theological debate and possibly reconciliation. But you could negotiate with people who believed God had commanded them to destroy your entire civilization. They didn't want reforms within the system. They wanted the system burned to ash so something entirely different could emerge from the ruins. The Taborites of Bohemia demonstrated how apocalyptic belief could transform into sustained military resistance. Emerging from the Hussite movement in the early 15th century, the Taborites established communes based on radical principles of social and economic equality. They rejected private property, shared resources communally, and organized themselves according to what they believed were divine commands about how society should function. When the Church and Holy Roman Empire sent crusades to destroy them, the Taborites fought back with surprising effectiveness, defeating multiple military expeditions through tactics that combined religious fervor with genuine military competence. These movements operated through networks that resembled later revolutionary organizations. Charismatic preachers traveled between regions, spreading apocalyptic messages and establishing cells of believers who could support each other and organize locally. They developed coded language and signals that allowed members to recognize each other without revealing themselves to authorities. They maintained safe houses where traveling preachers could find shelter and support. The organizational sophistication often surprised authorities who assumed that movements of poor and desperate people would be disorganized mobs, rather than networks capable of coordinated action across vast distances. The theology underlying apocalyptic movements was often more sophisticated than official accounts acknowledged. Leaders of these movements developed complex interpretations of biblical prophecy, historical patterns they claimed revealed God's timeline for ending the current age, and philosophical justifications for why destroying existing institutions was necessary for salvation. Dismissing them as ignorant fanatics was comforting for authorities, but inaccurate. Many apocalyptic leaders were educated individuals who had studied theology extensively and had concluded that the institutional church had become too corrupt to reform. That revolutionary transformation was the only path forward. Suppressing apocalyptic movements presented unique challenges. Conventional repression often backfired spectacularly. Martyring apocalyptic believers confirmed their narrative that they were holy warriors facing persecution from an evil world destined for destruction. Each execution created heroes whose stories inspired new converts. Military force worked only if authorities could catch and kill entire movements before they spread, and the distributed nature of apocalyptic networks made comprehensive suppression nearly impossible. By the time authorities crushed the movement in one region, it had already spread to others where the process had to begin again. Some rulers suspected foreign manipulation behind apocalyptic uprisings. When millennial movements erupted in your kingdom but not in your rivals, it was tempting to imagine that rivals' agents had fomented the uprising as a form of proxy warfare. Evidence for such manipulation is limited, but the suspicion reveals how threatening these movements were. Authorities could more easily accept that they were facing enemy conspiracy than acknowledge that their own populations were genuinely embracing ideologies calling for civilizational destruction and rebirth. The movement's rejection of all earthly authority created theological and political crises that authorities struggled to address. If believers accepted only God's commands as mediated through their own prophets and visions, then neither church nor state held legitimate power over them. Excommunication meant nothing to people who'd already rejected the church's authority. Legal proceedings were meaningless to those who denied that earthly laws had any validity compared to divine commandments. This left authorities with only violence as a response, which, as already noted, often strengthened movements rather than destroying them. Apocalyptic movements represented a form of conspiracy that went beyond the political machinations examined in earlier chapters. These weren't groups seeking to manipulate power structures for advantage. They were groups seeking to destroy those structures entirely, convinced that divine will required total transformation. The medieval world faced periodic eruptions of genuinely revolutionary energy that couldn't be co-opted, negotiated with, or channeled into acceptable forms. These movements had to be crushed completely, or they would continue spreading, attracting everyone desperate enough or faithful enough to believe that burning down the world might be worth it if God was commanding the fire. Most apocalyptic movements were indeed crushed, their members killed or scattered, their prophecies proven false when the world continued despite their expectations. But the underlying impulse survived each suppression, waiting in the apocalyptic elements of Christian tradition for the next crisis, the next charismatic preacher, the next moment when enough people would become desperate or faithful enough to believe that the only solution to corruption and suffering was complete destruction followed by divine recreation. The apocalyptic conspiracy was one that medieval authorities could never permanently defeat because it was built into the religion that legitimized their rule, a permanent revolutionary possibility lurking within the theological foundations of Christian civilization, occasionally erupting with enough force to terrify everyone whose power depended on the current world continuing to exist. On the 13th of June 1381, a massive crowd of English peasants and urban workers marched into London, opened prisons, burned the palace of the king, Uncle John of Gaunt, and executed the Archbishop of Canterbury along with several royal officials. The peasants' revolt shocked England's ruling class not just because of its violence, but because of what it revealed. Common people who were supposed to be isolated, ignorant, and incapable of coordinated action had organized a movement that nearly toppled the government. The coordination was too extensive, too rapid, too sophisticated to have been spontaneous. Somewhere beneath the surface of rural England, peasants had been organizing, communicating, and planning resistance for long enough that when the moment came, they could mobilize thousands across multiple counties in a matter of days. The stereotype of medieval peasants as passive, ignorant victims of elite machinations serves those elites well then and now. But evidence reveals a different reality. Peasant communities maintained underground networks that shared information, coordinated resistance, and preserved collective memory of rights and customs that lords tried to erode. These weren't formal organizations with written charters and official membership. They were organic conspiracies built on kinship bonds, village solidarity, and shared interest in resisting exploitation that grew more oppressive as feudal lords struggled with economic pressures. The methods commoners used for secret communication showed remarkable sophistication. Certain folk songs that appeared to be simple entertainment actually contained coded messages about gathering times, targets for resistance, or warnings about informants. The lyrics seemed innocuous to authorities who didn't understand the local context, but villagers who grown up with these songs knew how to decode them. Traveling minstrels and entertainers served as information couriers, moving between villages with legitimate reasons for their presence, while carrying messages embedded in performances that authorities dismissed as mere amusement for simple peasants. Religious pilgrimage created another cover for political coordination. Peasants traveling to local shrines had legitimate reasons to leave their villages, to meet with people from other regions, to gather in groups that would otherwise attract suspicion. These pilgrimages became opportunities for conspiracy leaders to coordinate across distances, to share strategies and information, to build networks that connected isolated rural communities into larger systems of mutual support and coordinated resistance. The religious context provided perfect cover. Who would suspect that people praying at a saint's shrine were actually organizing rebellion? The Jacquerie uprising in France in 1358 revealed similar patterns. The revolt erupted with shocking speed, with thousands of peasants simultaneously attacking noble estates across multiple regions. Authorities assumed this was spontaneous rage from people pushed beyond endurance by wartime taxation and noble violence. But the coordination suggested something more organized. How did peasants across different regions know to rise at approximately the same time? How did they coordinate targets and tactics without any apparent leadership structure? The answer lay in underground networks that had existed for years, preparing for the moment when conditions became intolerable enough that open revolt seemed worth the enormous risks. Medieval commoners developed sophisticated counterintelligence practices to protect their conspiracies. They used codes that outsiders could penetrate, maintained security through community bonds that made betrayal personally and socially costly, and fed misleading information to authorities when they sensed investigation. Village communities protected each other through collective silence. Everyone knew certain things, but no one admitted knowing them when outsiders asked questions. This solidarity was both practical and cultural, rooted in awareness that breaking community confidence could mean destruction for everyone. The very fact that peasant coordination occurred at all terrified authorities precisely because they worked so hard to keep commoners isolated and ignorant. Literacy was restricted, travel was controlled, and community organization beyond church-approved structures was discouraged. If peasants could coordinate resistance despite all these obstacles, it revealed capabilities that undermined the entire justification for feudal hierarchy. The theoretical basis for noble rule included the premise that commoners were inherently incapable of self-governance, that they needed aristocratic authority to function. Peasant conspiracies proving otherwise threatened the ideological foundations of medieval society. These common conspiracies sometimes achieved concrete victories. The English peasants' revolt was ultimately crushed, but it established psychological impact that made authorities more cautious about extreme exploitation. Some regions gained formal recognition of rights and limitations on feudal obligations because lords feared that pushing too hard would trigger new uprisings. The precedents established through peasant resistance contributed to the gradual erosion of serfdom across Europe, not because lords became more compassionate, but because the threat of organized peasant violence made certain forms of exploitation more costly than they were worth. Elite and common conspiracies occasionally intersected in complex ways. Nobles plotting against kings sometimes armed peasants and encouraged uprisings, calculating that rural chaos would weaken royal authority, while the nobles maintained enough military force to protect their own estates. Peasant leaders sometimes sought alliances with sympathetic nobles or urban merchants who could provide military expertise, weapons, or political legitimacy that pure peasant movements lacked. These alliances were unstable. Elite allies often betrayed peasant movements once they'd achieved their own objectives, but they demonstrated that conspiracy wasn't confined to single social classes acting independently. Urban workers developed similar conspiratorial networks in medieval cities. Craft guilds officially focused on regulating trades and maintaining quality standards, but they also coordinated strikes, price fixing, and political action that challenged merchant oligarchies and royal authority. When guilds moved against opponents, they did so with coordination that revealed extensive planning and communication networks. Urban conspiracies connected to rural ones through market relationships, family ties, and shared grievances against taxation and elite predation. Medieval society operated with conspiracies functioning at every level simultaneously. Elites conspired against each other for power and wealth. Commoners conspired against elites for survival and rights. Sometimes these conspiracies collided, sometimes they aligned temporarily, Always they created a volatile environment where authority was never as secure as it appeared in official ceremonies and proclamations. The commoners' conspiracy was perhaps most threatening because it suggested that the foundation of medieval hierarchy, the supposed natural incapacity of ordinary people to organize their own affairs, was a lie that only remained believable as long as peasants and workers were prevented from demonstrating otherwise. When they did demonstrate otherwise, when underground networks coordinated uprisings that revealed sophisticated organization and clear political goals, the entire medieval order faced a truth it couldn't comfortably acknowledge: that the masses weren't naturally submissive or inherently inferior, that they'd been kept in subordination through violence. Limited access to resources and systematic denial of education and organization. The Commons' conspiracy proved that given opportunity and motivation, ordinary people could plan, coordinate, and fight for their interests as effectively as any noble cabalting in castle chambers. That truth, once visible, couldn't be completely hidden again, no matter how many peasant revolts were crushed or how many leaders were executed as examples. The knowledge that resistance was possible, that commoners could conspire successfully against their supposed superiors, became a permanent element of medieval political consciousness, waiting in every village and workshop for the next moment when exploitation became intolerable and organization became action. Rome taught the world many things: architecture, law, the concept of empire itself. But perhaps its most enduring lesson was this: power, once concentrated, attracts conspiracy like a carcass attracts vultures. And nowhere was this lesson more brutally demonstrated than in the institution that claimed to be above worldly concerns, the medieval Catholic Church, specifically in the office that declared itself the earthly representative of Christ himself. The papacy. We're told a comforting story about how popes were chosen. The College of Cardinals, guided by the Holy Spirit, would gather in sacred conclave. Through prayer and contemplation, they would discern God's will. White smoke would rise. A new pope would emerge, blessed by divine selection. It is a beautiful narrative. It is also, historically speaking, often complete fiction. The reality was considerably darker. The papacy was the ultimate prize in medieval politics, a position that combined absolute spiritual authority over all of Western Christianity with massive temporal power, enormous wealth, and the ability to make or break kingdoms through excommunication and interdict. Control the papacy, and you controlled the spiritual destiny of millions while commanding resources that rivaled any kingdom. That kind of power doesn't attract the humble and pious. It attracts wolves. Papal elections were frequently determined not by divine guidance, but by conspiracy, bribery, military force, and occasionally straightforward murder. The methods were sophisticated, developed over generations by families who made controlling the papacy their primary business. These weren't crude schemes. They were elaborate, multi-generational conspiracies involving intelligence networks, strategic marriages, carefully cultivated cardinals, and when necessary, poison or a blade in the dark. Consider the Western Schism, which lasted nearly 4 decades beginning in 1378. Not one pope, not two, but at times 3 rival popes simultaneously claimed legitimate authority, each backed by different kingdoms, each excommunicating the others, each declaring himself the true vicar of Christ. Each was installed through conspiracy. The Avignon popes were effectively puppets of French interests. The Roman popes were backed by Italian factions. The Pisan popes emerged from attempts to resolve the conflict that only made it worse. For nearly 40 years, Western Christianity had no idea who actually held legitimate spiritual authority. Cardinals pledged allegiance based on political calculation, not theological conviction. The theological implications were catastrophic. If popes could excommunicate each other, if divine selection could somehow produce multiple contradictory results, what did that say about papal authority itself? Then there was the period historians delicately call the Saculum Obscurum, the dark age of the papacy, or more colourfully, the pornocracy, the rule of harlots. During the 10th century, powerful Roman families, particularly the Theophylacti, effectively controlled the papacy through a combination of sexual influence, strategic marriages, and murder. Pope John XII was allegedly installed through his family's machinations at age 18 and turned the Lateran Palace into what contemporary accounts described as a brothel. Pope Stephen VI had his predecessor's corpse exhumed, dressed in papal vestments, propped up in the papal throne, and put on trial in what became known as the Cadaver Synod, a grotesque display that had nothing to do with theology and everything to do with factional power struggles. Several popes during this period were murdered by rivals within the church itself. The methods used in these conspiracies were remarkably sophisticated. Certain families, the Orsini, the Colonna, the Borgia, specialized in getting their members elected pope across multiple generations. They understood that papal elections weren't won during the conclave itself, but years before through careful cultivation of cardinal electors. They maintained intelligence networks tracking which cardinals were vulnerable to which forms of persuasion, financial pressure for some, sexual scandal for others, simple bribery for those whose price could be met, military intimidation for the stubborn. During conclaves, cardinals were sometimes imprisoned under conditions that would continue until they produced the correct result. In 1241, the conclave in Rome lasted months, while cardinals were locked in appalling conditions. Some died during the deliberations. The pressure was explicit: choose the candidate acceptable to the dominant faction or suffer indefinitely. In 1271, the conclave in Viterbo lasted nearly 3 years. The city's leaders eventually locked the cardinals in the episcopal palace, removed the roof to expose them to the elements, and reduced their food rations to bread and water until they finally elected a pope. This was presented as divine guidance made manifest. Some popes lived in constant fear of assassination by rival factions within the church itself. The Vatican was as dangerous as any medieval battlefield, perhaps more so because the weapons were poison and conspiracy rather than honest steel. Popes employed food tasters. They slept in guarded chambers. They trusted no one, because trust was the fastest path to a successor being elected. The irony was profound. The man claiming to be Christ's representative on earth, protected by divine authority, needed bodyguards and poison testers to survive other men who claimed to serve Christ. These internal conflicts fundamentally compromised the Church's spiritual mission. When popes were chosen through conspiracy rather than divine guidance, when rival popes hurled mutual excommunications, when the selection process involved more bribery than prayer, the entire theological foundation of papal authority was undermined. If God truly guided the Church, how could his selection process be so easily hijacked by worldly conspirators? The Church developed elaborate theological justifications to explain away this chaos while maintaining the fiction of divine selection. God worked in mysterious ways. The Holy Spirit could guide even corrupted processes toward correct outcomes. Earthly sins didn't invalidate heavenly authority. These explanations grew more complex as the evidence of conspiracy grew more obvious. The truth was simpler and darker. The Church, supposedly Christianity's unified institution, was actually a battleground for competing conspiracies. Spiritual authority served as cover for very worldly power struggles. The papacy was won not through holiness but through superior conspiracy, better intelligence, more effective bribery, more ruthless elimination of rivals. This wasn't occasional corruption, it was systematic. Generation after generation, the highest office in Western Christianity was determined by whoever could orchestrate the most effective conspiracy. The weapons were different from secular power struggles, but the game was identical, and everyone involved understood the rules, even as they maintained the public fiction of divine guidance. But if papal elections were so thoroughly compromised, what about the rest of church hierarchy? Every medieval Christian was taught that simony, the buying or selling of church offices, was a mortal sin named after Simon Magus, who tried to purchase the power of the Holy Spirit from the apostles. The prohibition was absolute, canon law was clear. Popes regularly condemned the practice, and yet behind the official condemnations there was a thriving market where bishoprics had price tags, abbeys could be purchased, and parish positions were traded like commodities. The gap between what the Church said and what the Church did was enormous, and almost everyone knew it. Church positions were extraordinarily valuable. A bishopric provided guaranteed income from tithes and church lands, social status equal to nobility, political influence over secular rulers, and legal privileges that placed the holder above normal law. An abbey controlled extensive properties and resources. Even a simple parish position offered steady income and respect. These weren't just spiritual offices, they were economic assets, political tools, and social capital combined. Wealthy families wanted them for their sons, and they were willing to pay. The mechanisms of this trade were sophisticated. Brokers emerged who specialized in negotiating church appointments, men who knew which cardinals needed money, which bishops controlled appointments in their regions, which monasteries had positions available. These brokers operated discreetly, arranging meetings between buyers and sellers, negotiating prices, structuring payments to avoid obvious detection. Certain cathedrals and monasteries became known among the wealthy as places where the right payment, presented as a gift or donation, could secure a position for a family member. The schemes developed to disguise simony were elaborate. Direct payment for office was too obvious, so transactions were structured differently. A wealthy family would make a generous donation to a monastery, unrelated of course to the fact that their son was appointed abbot shortly afterward. A noble would provide valuable lands to a bishop, purely from piety naturally, and his nephew would subsequently receive a lucrative church position in that diocese. The payment and the appointment were separated by time and obscured by layers of legitimate, seeming transactions, but everyone involved understood the real exchange. This created what we might call a conspiracy economy. Those who paid bribes, those who received them, and those who facilitated the transactions all faced severe penalties if exposed: loss of office, excommunication, possible criminal prosecution. This mutual vulnerability prevented betrayal. Everyone had incentives to maintain the fiction of legitimate appointments and the reality of purchased offices. The system was self-protecting because exposure would destroy all participants. When simony scandals occasionally erupted, they revealed just how extensive the practice was. Entire networks would be exposed: bishops who sold positions to fund their own ambitions, monasteries where every office had a price, regional churches where appointments hadn't been legitimate in decades. The scandals were shocking, not because simony was unusual, but because the scale being revealed made it impossible to pretend otherwise. This corruption fundamentally compromised the church's mission. Positions went to those who could pay rather than those with spiritual qualifications or calling. Men who purchased bishoprics viewed them as investments to be exploited for profit. Clergy who bought their positions felt entitled to extract maximum revenue from their offices to recover their investment and profit beyond it. The result was a church hierarchy populated by men who treated spiritual authority as a business venture. Some families maintained elaborate multi-generational strategies, systematically placing family members in church positions to build networks of influence and channel resources. The Medici family's approach to securing church offices for family members was legendary. They understood that strategic placement of relatives in key positions, purchased through carefully disguised payments, could secure both spiritual authority and temporal power across generations. Other families followed similar strategies, treating the church hierarchy as territory to be colonized through careful investment. Reform movements periodically attempted to suppress simony. Serious reformers genuinely wanted to restore spiritual integrity to church appointments. But the economic interests threatened by reform were enormous, and conspiracies developed specifically to protect the simony system from reformers. Bishops who profited from selling positions worked together to undermine reform efforts. Brokers adjusted their methods to avoid new regulations. Families developed more sophisticated disguises for their payments. The fascinating reality is that many medieval people distinguished between the church's ideal claims and its actual operations. They knew offices were bought and sold. They understood that many clergy had purchased their positions. They even participated in the system when opportunity allowed. But they maintained the public fiction of divine appointments and legitimate spiritual authority, because the alternative, acknowledging that the church hierarchy was essentially a market, would undermine the entire foundation of religious life. The system persisted because it served too many interests. The church gained revenue from selling offices. Wealthy families gained status and influence from placing members in church positions. Clergy who purchased offices gained income and privilege. Everyone involved benefited from maintaining both the conspiracy and the fiction that denied it. But if church offices themselves could be bought and sold like property, what about the church's ultimate product? the promise of salvation itself. Medieval Christianity taught that certain objects held miraculous power: a bone from a saint's body, a splinter from the true cross, a vial of holy blood. These weren't merely symbolic. They were believed to possess genuine supernatural potency, to heal diseases, protect cities, guarantee salvation. Similarly, indulgences offered measurable reductions in purgatory's torments, quantified with precision. 40 days off for this prayer, 300 years remitted for that donation. The spiritual realm had been given concrete, tradable form. Where such demand existed, supply inevitably followed. And where enormous profit was possible, fraud flourished. The scale of the relic trade's deception becomes clear when you examine the mathematics. If every fragment of the true cross displayed in medieval churches were authentic, you could build not a cross, but a forest. Multiple churches claimed to possess the prepuce of Christ, a biological impossibility for a single individual. Saints apparently had multiple skulls, numerous complete sets of bones, and body parts that exceeded any normal human inventory. The Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela possessed one head of St. James. The church in Armenia possessed another. Both were authenticated by ecclesiastical authorities. Both generated enormous pilgrimage revenue. These weren't innocent mistakes. They were conspiracies maintained at the highest levels. Ecclesiastical authorities authenticated relics they knew or strongly suspected were fraudulent because the economic value was too significant to surrender. A church possessing an important relic became a pilgrimage destination. Pilgrims brought donations, purchased accommodations, bought souvenirs, enriched entire regions. To admit a relic was fake meant losing this revenue stream and the prestige that accompanied it. So authorities authenticated dubious objects, developed elaborate backstories for their provenance, and defended their authenticity against rival churches making competing claims. Networks developed to supply this demand. Some specialized in relic theft, stealing authenticated relics from one church to sell to another. These weren't random criminals, but organized operations with church contacts who could provide documentation for stolen items. Others manufactured relics wholesale, producing bones supposedly from early Christian martyrs, fragments allegedly from biblical locations, objects with invented but plausible histories. The most successful forgers understood what made relics credible: age-appropriate materials, theologically appropriate backstories, documentation that looked authentic, even if entirely fabricated. The competition between churches was fierce and occasionally descended into outright war. When multiple institutions claimed the same relic, they couldn't all be authentic, yet each defended its possession through ecclesiastical authority, forged documents, and sometimes military force. The conspiracy required to maintain these conflicting claims involved layers of church hierarchy, each level protecting the level above while enriching itself below. The indulgence trade followed similar patterns of corruption. Sellers promised specific time reductions in purgatory, 10,000 years for this payment, complete remission for that donation. They employed sophisticated psychological manipulation, appealing to grief over deceased relatives and fear of damnation. Traveling indulgence salesmen operated like medieval con artists with official church backing, moving from town to town with elaborate presentations designed to maximize emotional impact and revenue extraction. Johann Tetzel, whose indulgence sales in Germany would trigger Martin Luther's protest, reportedly used the slogan, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." The transaction was explicit. Payment produced guaranteed spiritual results, quantified and commercialized. Salvation itself had become a commodity with a price list. Some church officials were undoubtedly cynical fraudsters who understood exactly what they were doing. Others occupied more ambiguous moral territory. They may have convinced themselves that even false relics could produce genuine spiritual benefits if believers had sufficient faith. That indulgences, even if their specific mechanisms were dubious, encouraged piety and charitable giving. This psychological complexity doesn't excuse the fraud, but it helps explain how individuals could participate in these conspiracies without seeing themselves as corrupt. The Shroud of Turin represents perhaps the most elaborate of these conspiracies. Its authentication involved multiple church levels, complex provenance claims, and sophisticated defenses against skeptics. Whether those who authenticated it believed their own claims or knowingly perpetuated fraud remains debated. What is undeniable is that the conspiracy surrounding the shroud generated enormous revenue and prestige for those institutions that controlled it. These practices generated criticism even in the medieval period. Reformers argued that the relic and indulgence trades corrupted Christianity's spiritual core, turning faith into commerce and salvation into a purchasable commodity. These criticisms largely failed to reform the system because too many powerful interests profited from maintaining it. But the tensions these conspiracies created within Christianity were building toward rupture. The gap between the Church's spiritual claims and its commercial practices was widening. The theological contradictions were becoming impossible to ignore. When Martin Luther finally posted his 95 Theses in 1517, his primary target was indulgence abuse, the most visible symbol of a church that had turned salvation itself into a conspiracy of profit. Yet even as these religious conspiracies approached their crisis point, another type of conspiracy was developing in medieval Europe, one that challenged not just corrupt church practices but the entire medieval understanding of reality itself. Medieval orthodoxy had a simple principle: all knowledge must serve theology. Every question, every investigation, every conclusion had to align with church doctrine as defined by ecclesiastical authority. Natural philosophy could explore how God's creation worked, but only if the answers confirmed what theology already taught. Logic could be applied to understanding scripture, but only if it reinforced approved interpretations. The moment inquiry threatened doctrine, it became heresy. This created an impossible situation for anyone genuinely committed to following questions wherever they led. And so, as with every form of forbidden activity, a conspiracy emerged. An intellectual underground of scholars who thought dangerous thoughts, preserved forbidden texts, and transmitted ideas that could result in execution if discovered. The danger was real. In 1277, the Bishop of Paris condemned 219 philosophical propositions as heretical. Many were sophisticated philosophical positions derived from careful study of Aristotle and Arabic commentators. The condemnation didn't just ban teaching these ideas. It retroactively made anyone who had entertained them suspect. Careers were destroyed. Some fled. Others recanted. A few continued their work in secret. Peter Abelard represented the early threat that pure logic posed to unquestioned doctrine. His method was straightforward: take theological positions seriously enough to examine their logical consistency. He compiled contradictory statements from church fathers, not to mock Christianity, but to demonstrate that authorities disagreed, and therefore reason must arbitrate. The implication was explosive. If reason could judge between contradictory authorities, then reason stood above authority. His teaching career was destroyed multiple times. His work was condemned. He was forced to burn his own writings. Yet his methods spread, taught by students who understood that his approach threatened the entire structure of medieval thought. Siger of Brabant went further, teaching Averroist philosophy at the University of Paris, despite explicit prohibitions. Averroes had argued that Aristotle's philosophy demonstrated truths, the eternity of the world, the unity of intellect across all humans, that contradicted Christian theology. Siger taught these positions openly in philosophy lectures while acknowledging they conflicted with faith. He was attempting to create intellectual space where philosophical truth and theological truth could coexist even in contradiction. The Church understood exactly what this meant: reason independent of revelation, philosophy operating in a realm where doctrine had no authority. Siger was summoned to face inquisitorial investigation. He fled Paris. He died under mysterious circumstances in Italy, possibly murdered. Roger Bacon pursued experimental investigation of nature with an enthusiasm that alarmed his superiors. He conducted optical experiments, studied alchemy, explored mathematics, and wrote extensively about learning from observation rather than authority. His Franciscan order imprisoned him for years. His crime wasn't explicit heresy, but something perhaps more threatening, demonstrating that careful observation of nature could reveal truths that authority hadn't taught, and that scripture hadn't mentioned. These weren't isolated individuals. They were nodes in networks that spread across Europe. Scholars corresponded using careful language that concealed dangerous meanings from casual readers while communicating clearly to those who understood the codes. Students traveled between universities carrying forbidden texts concealed among orthodox materials, seeking teachers rumored to possess knowledge unavailable in official curricula. Manuscripts circulated privately, copied by hand, shared only with trusted individuals. Ideas moved through underground channels, spreading despite condemnation. Certain monasteries became unexpected havens for intellectual exploration. Some abbots valued learning enough to protect scholars pursuing controversial questions. Some recognized that rigid orthodoxy stifled the very curiosity that led to deeper understanding of God's creation. These institutions maintained libraries with texts that were forbidden elsewhere, hosted scholars who had fled condemnation, and allowed discussions that couldn't happen in more exposed settings. They operated a conspiracy of tolerance within an intolerant system. The phenomenon of double truth represented an attempt to create formal space for intellectual freedom without explicit heresy. Scholars would teach that something was philosophically true, the eternity of matter, for example, while acknowledging that theology taught differently. They claimed to be demonstrating what pure reason concluded, not what they personally believed. The distinction was often sincere, sometimes convenient, always dangerous. It suggested that reason and revelation could reach contradictory conclusions, and that both could be valid in their respective domains. The church authorities understood the threat. If philosophy could operate independently of theology, if natural investigation could discover truths unknown to revelation, if reason could judge the logical consistency of doctrine, then the entire medieval synthesis that made theology the queen of sciences was undermined. The intellectual monopoly that gave the church control over legitimate knowledge would collapse. Yet despite persecution, the conspiracy persisted. Each generation produced scholars willing to risk everything to think freely. They wrote in technical Latin that educated readers could follow, but that provided some cover from less sophisticated censors. They attributed dangerous positions to others rather than claiming them directly. They used euphemisms and carefully qualified language. They operated in the margins of what was permissible, occasionally crossing into explicit forbidden territory. This underground intellectual work wasn't separate from the later Renaissance and scientific revolution. It was their foundation. The scholars who openly challenged medieval thought in the 16th and 17th centuries were building on centuries of conspiratorial intellectual labor by those who had preserved forbidden texts, developed critical methods, and demonstrated that nature could be investigated independently of theological authority. The ideas that would eventually dismantle the medieval worldview didn't arrive suddenly from nowhere. They were cultivated slowly, carefully, dangerously by generations of scholars who understood that some questions were worth dying for, and that truth, wherever it led, deserved pursuit even when pursuit meant conspiracy. But philosophical ideas alone weren't enough to transform the medieval world. Another form of forbidden knowledge was being pursued in secret laboratories and dissection rooms. Philosophy questioned theology's claims, but there was another form of forbidden knowledge being pursued in medieval Europe. One that didn't argue with church doctrine but simply ignored it. In workshops hidden from public view in monasteries' private chambers, in the homes of wealthy patrons who valued curiosity over orthodoxy, men were investigating nature itself, not through theological deduction about what God must have done, but through observation and experiment to discover what actually was. This required conspiracy because the church claimed authority over all truth. If natural investigation revealed conclusions that contradicted doctrine, the investigator faced a choice: abandon the discovery or risk condemnation. Many chose a third option: pursue the work in secret. Alchemy embodied this contradiction perfectly. To the uninitiated, alchemical texts appeared to be mystical nonsense, filled with symbolic imagery of lions devouring suns, dragons, kings and queens in elaborate weddings, obscure references to philosophical mercury and spiritual sulfur. This obscurity was deliberate. It served two purposes simultaneously: protecting genuine discoveries from those who would misuse them, and concealing investigations that might be condemned as demonic if their true nature were understood. Behind the symbolism, medieval alchemists were conducting genuine chemical investigation. They identified substances we now recognize as elements. They developed techniques for purification, distillation, and combination that would form the foundation of chemistry. They discovered acids capable of dissolving metals. They created alloys with novel properties. They investigated the behavior of matter with systematic observation. The mystical language wasn't fraudulent. Many alchemists genuinely believed they were investigating spiritual truths manifest in material form. But it also provided cover for work that approached matter as something that could be understood through investigation rather than through theological pronouncement. The alchemical conspiracy extended beyond individual workshops. Networks formed, with practitioners corresponding in coded language, sharing discoveries through deliberately obscure manuscripts, and training apprentices in techniques that couldn't be publicly taught. When an alchemist made a significant discovery, it spread through underground channels to others pursuing similar work, creating an invisible community of experimental investigators operating beneath official knowledge structures. Medieval physicians faced even more direct prohibitions. The Church restricted human dissection, considering the body sacred and its violation potentially blasphemous. Yet anatomical knowledge required examination of actual bodies, not just reading ancient authorities like Galen. Some physicians secretly dissected corpses, conducting literally criminal investigations to advance medical understanding. They worked at night, in secure locations, disposing of evidence carefully. Their discoveries about organ structure, blood flow, the relationship between anatomical features and disease had to be shared carefully, communicated only to trusted colleagues who would understand the knowledge's value and the danger in possessing it. These physicians formed networks parallel to the alchemical ones. Information passed through coded correspondence. Students traveled to specific locations where they knew dissection was practiced. Knowledge advanced through conspiracy because advancement through official channels was impossible. Some physicians discovered that diseases followed natural patterns, that epidemics had natural causes rather than representing divine punishment for sin. But expressing this too clearly meant challenging theological explanations of suffering, illness, and death. Astronomers faced similar tensions. Careful observation of celestial movements revealed patterns that seemed to follow mathematical regularities. The cosmos appeared to operate according to discoverable laws rather than moment-by-moment divine interventions. Some observations seemed to contradict biblical cosmology. The perfection of celestial spheres was challenged by observations of comets and new stars appearing in supposedly unchanging heavens. These observations couldn't be published without careful theological framing, and even then might attract dangerous attention. Naturalists who studied living things noticed patterns that suggested organization according to discoverable principles. Animals could be classified by characteristics. Plants showed relationships that implied natural families. Living things seemed adapted to their environments in ways that suggested regular processes rather than individual divine design of each creature. These observations had to be presented carefully, always subordinated to theological claims, even when the observations implied something different. All this work required support networks. Patrons who valued knowledge enough to protect controversial scholars provided financial backing and physical security. Workshops where experimental work could be concealed offered safe space for investigation. Communication networks allowed discoveries to circulate without attracting inquisitorial attention. Without these support structures, the work would have been impossible. The fascinating reality is that many medieval people distinguished between official knowledge, what had to be publicly affirmed, and practical knowledge, what actually worked. A physician might publicly attribute a cure to divine grace while privately understanding the natural mechanism. An astronomer might publicly frame observations in theological terms while privately recognizing they implied a cosmos that operated according to mathematical law. This cognitive flexibility allowed practical investigation to continue even within a system that claimed theological authority over all truth. When the scientific revolution emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries, it didn't create experimental investigation from nothing. It brought into public legitimacy methods and approaches that had been developed through centuries of conspiratorial work. The scientific method observation, hypothesis, experiment, verification had been practiced in secret for generations before it became officially respectable. The medieval alchemists, physicians, and naturalists who conspired to investigate nature directly were the foundation upon which modern science was built. These intellectual and scientific conspiracies represented something profound. They were the emergence of new ways of thinking that would eventually destroy the medieval worldview. Authority would be replaced by observation. Theological deduction would be displaced by experimental verification. The medieval synthesis that made all knowledge subordinate to church doctrine would collapse, replaced by systems where natural investigation operated independently of religious authority. But this transformation didn't happen suddenly. It required centuries of conspiratorial preparation, generations of thinkers willing to risk everything to pursue questions that threatened the entire established order. The modern world emerged not from sudden enlightenment, but from long conspiracy. While crusaders marched to the Holy Land declaring holy war against Islam, another group of Europeans was conspiring with Muslim scholars to smuggle something more dangerous than weapons across religious boundaries: knowledge. The early medieval period had been catastrophic for learning in Western Europe. Libraries burned, manuscripts were lost. The collapse of Roman infrastructure destroyed the educational systems that had preserved classical knowledge. By the 9th and 10th centuries, much of ancient Greek and Roman learning had simply vanished from Christian Europe. Aristotle's natural philosophy, Ptolemy's astronomy, Euclid's geometry, advanced medical texts, all gone, existing only in fragments and corrupted translations. But this knowledge hadn't disappeared, it had migrated. Islamic scholars had preserved Greek texts, translated them into Arabic, studied them intensively, and expanded them with original discoveries. By the 11th century, the Islamic world possessed intellectual resources that made Western European learning look primitive by comparison. They had the complete Aristotelian corpus. They had advanced mathematics, including algebra. They had sophisticated astronomical observations. They had medical knowledge far superior to anything available in Christian Europe. Some European scholars recognized this disparity and decided to do something about it. What followed was one of medieval history's most important conspiracies: the systematic translation of classical and Islamic knowledge into Latin, conducted through networks that had to navigate religious hostility, linguistic barriers, and church suspicion of foreign learning. The enterprise was dangerous because it challenged multiple orthodoxies simultaneously. Translating certain texts, particularly Aristotle's works on natural philosophy, was officially forbidden or strongly discouraged because they contained ideas that contradicted church doctrine. The translators were exposing Christian Europe to Islamic interpretations and expansions of classical thought, implicitly acknowledging that superior knowledge existed outside Christianity. And they were engaging in intellectual collaboration with Muslims and Jews at precisely the moment when crusades and persecutions were defining these groups as enemies. The networks required for this work were sophisticated. Translators needed extraordinary linguistic skills, fluency in Latin and Arabic at minimum, often Greek and Hebrew as well. They needed access to manuscripts held in multiple locations across the Mediterranean. They required patrons wealthy and courageous enough to support controversial work. They needed safe places to conduct translations, often in contact zones where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities overlapped despite official hostility. Certain locations became crucial nodes in this network. Toledo in Spain, conquered by Christians but retaining large Muslim and Jewish populations, became legendary for its translation activity. The Toledo School of Translators wasn't a formal institution, but a loose network of scholars from different religious backgrounds who collaborated on translations. Christian scholars would work with Muslim or Jewish experts who knew Arabic, sometimes with Jewish scholars who could also access Hebrew versions of Greek texts. The cultural complexity was extraordinary. Men who might be enemies in political or religious contexts collaborated in intellectual ones, suggesting that even in the medieval period some recognized that knowledge transcended cultural divisions. Gerard of Cremona exemplified this conspiratorial scholarship. He traveled to Toledo specifically to access Arabic manuscripts unavailable in Christian Europe. Over decades, he translated more than 70 crucial texts from Arabic into Latin: Ptolemy's Almagest, Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, Euclid's Elements, numerous works of Aristotle, and advanced mathematical texts. His translations fundamentally transformed European intellectual life. Yet he worked in relative obscurity, part of a network that understood its work was both essential and controversial. Sicily under Norman rule provided another crucial translation center. Here too, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars collaborated, translating Greek and Arabic texts into Latin. The Norman rulers, pragmatic about knowledge despite religious orthodoxy, protected these scholars and valued the translations for the practical advantages they provided in medicine, astronomy, and administration. The newly translated works circulated through underground channels initially. Manuscripts were copied and passed between trusted scholars. Students traveled to specific locations to access forbidden texts. University libraries acquired works without publicizing their holdings. Gradually, as the intellectual value became undeniable, these translations moved from conspiratorial circulation to broader acceptance. Though some texts remained controversial for centuries, the impact was revolutionary. European scholars suddenly had access to Aristotelian logic that allowed systematic philosophical investigation. They gained Ptolemaic astronomy that provided sophisticated mathematical models of celestial motion. They acquired Avicennan medicine that offered systematic understanding of disease and treatment far superior to existing European knowledge. They learned advanced mathematics that would later enable the scientific revolution. They encountered Arabic commentaries on classical texts that demonstrated possibilities for critical interpretation and intellectual innovation. The intellectual flourishing of the High Middle Ages, the university system, scholastic philosophy, advances in natural knowledge depended directly on this conspiratorial knowledge migration. The Renaissance itself, often portrayed as recovering classical learning, was actually recovering texts that the translation movement had made available centuries earlier. What makes this conspiracy particularly fascinating is what it reveals about medieval intellectual life. Despite crusades and religious hostility, despite theological claims that Christian doctrine contained all necessary truth, despite enormous political and cultural barriers, knowledge found ways to flow across boundaries. Scholars recognized that truth wasn't confined by religious or cultural borders. Some questions, how nature operates, how mathematics works, what logic demonstrates, transcended the political and religious divisions that defined medieval life in other contexts. This was knowledge smuggling on a civilizational scale, and it worked. The texts translated through these conspiratorial networks transformed European thought, laying foundations for everything that followed: the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, modernity itself. All these intellectual conspiracies, philosophical networks preserving forbidden ideas, alchemists and physicians investigating nature through observation, translators smuggling knowledge across cultural boundaries. We're gradually accumulating a critical mass of alternative knowledge and methodology that would eventually challenge the entire medieval worldview. We're taught to think of the Renaissance as a sudden awakening, medieval darkness giving way to light. A rediscovery of classical learning after centuries of ignorance, the birth of humanism, science, and modern thought from the ashes of a backward age. It is a satisfying narrative. Beginning, middle transformation, clean historical rupture. But what if that is not what happened at all? What if the Renaissance wasn't a sudden rebirth, but rather the moment when underground conspiracies that had been operating for centuries finally accumulated enough strength to emerge into daylight? When forbidden knowledge could finally speak its name? When networks that had preserved alternative ways of thinking no longer needed to hide? Consider what we've traced through this exploration of medieval conspiracy. The Templars developed banking systems, maintained international networks, and accumulated knowledge that survived their suppression through channels we can only partially reconstruct. Heretical groups preserved alternative spiritual traditions. Despite centuries of persecution, their ideas surviving through underground transmission, even when their organizations were destroyed. Secret societies maintained initiatic knowledge and organizational structures that transcended the official institutions that tried to eliminate them. Intellectual conspirators preserved and developed philosophical approaches that contradicted church doctrine. Alchemists and physicians investigated nature through observation and experiment despite prohibitions. Translators smuggled knowledge across cultural and religious boundaries. Artists and craftsmen encoded symbolic systems into their work. These weren't isolated phenomena. They were interconnected conspiracies, separate threads that began intersecting and reinforcing each other as the medieval period progressed. By the 14th and 15th centuries, something remarkable was happening. The accumulated mass of alternative thinking, preserved knowledge, and conspiratorial organization had reached a critical threshold. It could no longer be completely suppressed. Renaissance humanism didn't discover classical texts in dusty monasteries and suddenly realize ancient wisdom had been forgotten. Those texts had been carefully preserved, translated, and studied by conspiratorial networks for centuries. What changed wasn't the availability of knowledge, but the ability to discuss it openly. The difference between a 14th century scholar secretly reading Aristotle in a monastery cell and a 15th century humanist publicly lecturing on classical philosophy wasn't the knowledge itself, but the social conditions that finally permitted open engagement. Renaissance art incorporated symbolic systems, geometric principles, and esoteric knowledge that had been maintained by craft guilds and secret societies throughout the medieval period. The sophisticated use of perspective, proportion, and symbolic imagery didn't emerge from nowhere. It surfaced from traditions that had been transmitted through initiatic channels, finally becoming public as patronage systems and social conditions allowed artists to reveal what they had always known. Renaissance science built explicitly on underground medieval investigations. The experimental method, careful observation of nature, mathematical analysis of physical phenomena, these weren't invented in the 16th century. They were brought into public legitimacy after centuries of development in hidden workshops and private laboratories. When Galileo looked through his telescope and saw what contradicted official cosmology, he was continuing work that medieval astronomers had conducted in secret. When anatomists dissected bodies publicly, they were legitimizing what medieval physicians had done by candlelight behind locked doors. Even Renaissance politics employed methods learned from medieval conspiracy. The sophisticated statecraft of figures like Machiavelli drew on traditions of manipulation, intelligence gathering, and power projection that had been refined through centuries of conspiratorial practice. The Renaissance prince wasn't inventing duplicity. He was openly practicing what medieval conspirators had perfected in shadow. Many supposedly revolutionary Renaissance ideas had been circulating in conspiratorial circles for generations before becoming publicly acceptable. The notion that nature operated according to discoverable laws rather than moment-by-moment divine intervention. Medieval natural philosophers had explored this carefully. The idea that human reason could investigate truth independently of revelation. Forbidden philosophers had developed sophisticated versions of this position. The possibility that political power operated according to practical principles rather than divine ordination. Medieval conspirators had understood and manipulated this reality for centuries. What the Renaissance represented was the moment when enough wealth, patronage, political fragmentation, and social complexity existed that these underground traditions could finally emerge without immediate suppression. The printing press accelerated this process dramatically. Knowledge that had previously required dangerous personal connections could now spread through mechanical reproduction. But the knowledge itself, the methodologies, the alternative systems of thought, had been there all along, maintained by conspiracies that waited for their moment. The irony is profound. We celebrate the Renaissance as ending the medieval Dark Ages, as bringing light after centuries of darkness. But the Renaissance was actually medieval conspiracies succeeding, bringing their work from shadow into daylight. The light we celebrate was always there, burning in hidden places, tended by those willing to risk everything to preserve it. The Renaissance wasn't historical rupture, it was historical continuity. The moment when conspiratorial patience finally paid off, when underground became overground, when the hidden became revealed. Not sudden transformation, but gradual accumulation reaching critical mass. And if medieval conspiracies shaped the Renaissance so profoundly, their influence didn't end there. The medieval world ended centuries ago. The castles crumbled. The knights disappeared. The church lost its absolute grip on European consciousness. Yet something survived, something that traveled through the centuries like a genetic code embedded in the DNA of power itself. The conspiracies didn't die. They evolved, adapted, found new forms, and left patterns etched so deeply into how authority operates that if you know how to look, you can still see medieval shadows moving behind modern institutions. Consider the patterns we've traced through medieval conspiracy. Hidden networks operating parallel to official institutions. Secrecy and coded communication coordinating action beneath public awareness. Information manipulation shaping collective perception. Strategic violence deployed to eliminate threats. The convergence of economic, political, and ideological power in ways that official narratives never quite acknowledge. and always that tension between what institutions claim to be and how power actually operates. These patterns didn't vanish when the medieval period ended, they transformed. Modern intelligence agencies function with methods remarkably similar to medieval spy networks. The structure is different, the technology revolutionary, but the essential pattern remains: networks of agents, gathering information, operating under official authority while maintaining plausible deniability, using secrecy to coordinate actions that governments officially deny. Medieval kings had their informants in foreign courts, their spies disguised as merchants, their coded messages carried by trusted couriers. Today's agencies operate on vastly larger scales with technological capabilities medieval conspirators couldn't imagine. Yet the fundamental architecture of how secret intelligence networks function shows striking continuity with patterns established centuries ago. Financial systems preserve organizational principles traceable to medieval banking conspiracies. The Templars created international financial networks that operated across political boundaries, developed methods of moving value without moving physical currency, and accumulated power that eventually threatened the very kings they served. Modern international banking operates on infinitely larger scales with digital rather than physical transfers, yet certain structural patterns persist. Financial networks that transcend national control, mechanisms for moving wealth that remain opaque to outsiders. The accumulation of power through control of capital flows rather than direct political authority. Secret societies and elite networks maintain traditions and connections traceable to medieval predecessors. Masonic organizations preserve rituals and symbols with documented medieval origins. Intelligence community connections create informal networks that operate alongside official chains of command. Elite social clubs provide venues where power brokers meet outside public scrutiny. These modern networks differ profoundly from medieval guilds or knightly orders, yet they serve similar functions, creating bonds of trust and mutual interest among powerful individuals, establishing channels of communication and coordination that bypass official institutions, maintaining traditions and knowledge passed through selective membership rather than public education. Information control remains central to power, just as it was when the church controlled literacy and monasteries controlled books. The mechanisms have changed entirely, from illuminated manuscripts to mass media to algorithmic content distribution, but the underlying pattern persists. Those who control information flow shape collective perception. Those who determine what knowledge circulates and what remains hidden exercise power that doesn't require official authority. Medieval monks copying manuscripts decided what knowledge survived and what vanished. Today's platforms and algorithms make different kinds of decisions about information flow, but the power inherent in controlling what people know hasn't diminished, it is expanded. Modern institutional legitimacy often rests on narratives that obscure how power actually operates. Medieval kings claimed divine appointment while ruling through networks of violence and patronage that had nothing divine about them. The church proclaimed spiritual authority while wielding very earthly economic and political power. Today's institutions proclaim democratic accountability, transparent governance, rule of law, and these aren't empty claims. The modern world differs profoundly from medieval autocracy, yet understanding medieval conspiracy reveals how institutions can simultaneously make legitimate claims and operate through hidden networks that don't align with official narratives. Studying medieval conspiracy isn't just about understanding the past, it is about gaining tools to analyze present power structures more critically. The patterns established centuries ago created templates that powerful networks still follow because these patterns work. Secrecy provides protection and coordination. Hidden networks allow action without accountability. Information control shapes perception. Economic power translates into political influence regardless of official separation between commerce and governance. Understanding those ancient conspiracies gives you a map to navigate hidden power structures that still shape our world, not because modern conspiracies mirror medieval ones exactly, but because power, at its deepest levels, operates according to patterns that transcend any particular historical moment. Every throne in medieval Europe had its secrets. Every crown was won through conspiracies most will never know. Every official history concealed a hidden truth. But the real secret isn't any specific conspiracy we've uncovered today. It is the realization that history has always been written by conspiracies, that power has always operated through hidden networks, and that learning to see the shadows behind the light is the skill that separates those who understand how the world really works from those who believe what they're told to believe. We began this journey with a question. If so much of what we learned about medieval history was incomplete or misleading, what should we conclude? Not that everything is conspiracy, not that all official narratives are lies, but something more nuanced and more profound. Official historical narratives are always constructed by those with power to serve their interests. This isn't cynicism, it is recognition of how memory works at a collective level. The victors write the histories, yes, but more than that, those who control institutions decide what gets preserved and what gets destroyed, what gets emphasized and what gets quietly forgotten. Medieval monasteries copied certain texts thousands of times while letting others crumble into dust. Royal chroniclers recorded events that glorified their patrons while omitting embarrassing truths. Church historians preserved orthodoxy while erasing heretical alternatives. What we call history is what survived that filtering process, and that process was never neutral. What gets remembered and what gets forgotten is never accidental. Behind every gap in the historical record lies a decision, conscious or unconscious, to let certain stories vanish. The Cathars left almost no writings in their own voice. We know them primarily through the words of those who exterminated them. The victims of medieval conspiracies rarely got to tell their versions of events. The networks operating in secrecy designed their operations specifically to leave no traces. Recognizing these absences is as important as studying what remains. Every era has its hidden history operating beneath public events. Medieval Europe is not unique in this regard. The same pattern appears across all times and places, visible events playing out on history's stage while beneath, invisible hands pull strings, make deals, coordinate actions that official chronicles will never acknowledge. Understanding medieval conspiracy teaches us to look for these hidden layers in any historical moment, including our own. Understanding conspiracy isn't about paranoia. It is about recognizing the gap between how power presents itself and how it actually operates. Kings claimed divine right while bribing supporters and assassinating rivals. The Church proclaimed spiritual authority while deploying very earthly violence against threats. Guilds presented themselves as guardians of quality while restricting competition through closed networks. Learning to see these gaps doesn't make you suspicious of everything, it makes you a better reader of how institutions function. The epistemological challenges are real. Much about medieval conspiracies remains uncertain. Evidence is fragmentary, often deliberately destroyed, sometimes forged. We must distinguish between solid historical evidence and speculation. Some stories that sound like conspiracies might have simpler explanations. Some apparent patterns might be coincidences, but acknowledging what we don't know is itself a form of honesty that conventional histories often lack. Admitting uncertainty is more truthful than pretending clear answers exist where evidence is murky. What does the existence of medieval conspiracies tell us about human nature and social organization? That people pursue power through hidden means when open methods are blocked. That alternative knowledge and values persist even under repression. That no system of control is ever complete. That history is made by far more people than the famous names we remember. By anonymous scribes preserving forbidden texts, by merchants moving information across continents, by individuals making choices in moments of danger that collectively shaped civilizations. Medieval conspiracies demonstrate both the worst and best of human nature, the manipulation, certainly, the violence and deception, the corruption of institutions meant to serve higher purposes, but also the courage of those who preserved truth despite danger. The intellectual curiosity that kept forbidden knowledge alive, the determination to maintain alternative communities when mainstream society offered no space for difference, the creativity of those who built hidden networks capable of coordinating action across vast distances with medieval technology. History should be read as a detective story. Always ask who benefits from particular narratives, what is being emphasized and what is being hidden, who had motives to shape events in particular ways. What alternative versions might have existed that didn't survive? Which voices are present in the record and which are absent? These questions don't lead to cynicism, they lead to deeper understanding. The medieval world is gone, but its lessons remain. Beneath every official story, hidden hands are always at work, writing a different story that only those who know where to look can read. Understanding medieval conspiracy isn't just about the past. It is a skill set for reading any moment in history, for recognizing patterns of how power operates regardless of the specific forms it takes in different eras. The secrets behind medieval thrones aren't really about medieval thrones at all. They're about the eternal dance between visible authority and invisible networks, between what history records and what history conceals, between the stories we're told and the truths we discover when we learn to look beneath the surface. And now you know where to look.